In downtown Dallas, President Kennedy was shot today just as his motorcade left downtown Dallas. Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed Mr. Kennedy. She cried, "Oh no." The motorcade sped on. A photographer said he saw blood on the president's head. It was believed 2 shots were fired. Keep tuned to your NBC station for the later news.
NBC Newsroom in New York. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally of Texas have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. We'll repeat that. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally of Texas have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body cradled in the arms of his wife, Jacqueline, had been rushed to Parkland Hospital. Clint Hill, a Secret Service agent assigned to Mrs. Kennedy, said he's dead as the president was lifted from the rear of a White House touring car, the famous bubble top from Washington. He was rushed to an emergency room in the hospital. Other White House officials were in doubt as the corridors of the hospital erupted in pandemonium. The incident occurred just east of the triple underpass facing a park in downtown Dallas. Reporters about 5 car lengths behind the chief executive were behind the autocade. Stay tuned to your NBC station for the later news.
We'll all stand by then and just relay the information as it comes in. Obviously, it's going to be sketchy for some time because you can imagine what is happening to every circuit, radio and telephone between the East Coast and Dallas, Texas at this moment. Obviously, the circuits are jammed. The information that we have, this is no time, obviously, for speculation. Facts are all that are warranted. Here is something else. It was impossible to tell at once where Kennedy was hit, but bullet wounds in Governor Connally's chest were plainly visible, indicating the gunfire might possibly have come from an automatic weapon.
There is this, Chet. Representative Albert Thomas, a member of the House of Representatives, said he was informed that President Kennedy and Governor Connally are both still alive after having been shot in an assassination attempt. This is from Dallas. It is the first word we have that they are, in fact, still alive. It is the first thing definitive that we have. As we say, we can give you only as much as we have. It is that both men were wounded by an assailant or assailants. It's not known who did it or why. And it was also reported from Dallas that it was not determined whether the Secret Service and Dallas police returned the gunfire that hit the president and the Texas governor. There is no word that the assailants have been captured or cited, probably because the focus of attention now, understandably, is on the president and not so much on those who committed this act.
I have some additional information here, Bill, which would indicate that the Secret Service men guarding the president had no chance to return fire. This item says, reporters about 5 car lengths behind the chief executive heard what sounded like 3 bursts of gunfire. Secret Service agents in a follow-up car quickly unlimbered their automatic rifles. The bubble top of the president's car was down. They drew their pistols, but the damage was done. The president was slumped over in the back seat of the car, face down. Then Governor Connally, after slumping to the left for a moment, lay on the floor of the rear seat.
More, Chet, on the quote from Congressman Thomas. He is outside the corridor of the emergency room in which the president and Governor Connally are under treatment. He said he had been told the president was still alive, but, quote, in very critical condition. That from Congressman Albert Thomas, a Texas Democrat, who was in the hospital, Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, where President Kennedy and Governor Connally of Texas have been taken after having been wounded in an apparent assassination attempt. A reporter, the AP man, Jack Bell, says the president and Governor Connally were shot as the motorcade entered a triple underpass, which leads to a freeway. They were leaving Dallas. Bell said a man and a woman were scrambling on the upper level of a walkway which overlooked the underpass. Also significant, the president's bubble-top car, the bubble was down at the time this happened. There is nothing yet to indicate that this man and woman were in any way connected with the attack. They have sent out from Parkland Hospital a call for top surgical specialists in Dallas and also a call for a Roman Catholic priest. But again, the best information we have now is that the president is still alive, but a member of Congress who is outside the emergency room where the president is being treated at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, says he has been told that the president is in very critical condition.
Bill, if I may suggest this, you and Chet have been so busy bringing the bulletin information to the audience. Of course, a great many people are not aware of the earlier details of the story, and radio and television sets have been going on all around the country. So I wonder if for their benefit as well as for mine, I'm getting in on it late, if you could reconstruct what we know from the top in chronological order, insofar as you have those details.
Well, basically, Frank, of course, the president was on this 2-day trip to Texas, making a series of speeches. It was said that one of his missions in Texas was to try and coalesce the divergent wings of the Democratic Party. He had made a speech in Fort Worth, Texas, which is, I think, about 25 or 30 miles from Dallas. He then moved to Dallas and was about to make a speech, was on his way to another site of a speech in Dallas, or just on the fringes of the city.
This was a motorcade?
It was a motorcade, and it was moving with, as has been reported, the bubble top of the presidential car down. This may have been a tragic mistake. But all we know is that at roughly 12:45 or so, the shots were fired.
Central Standard Time?
I think it would have been Dallas time. Yes, it would have been Dallas time. It has happened within the past...
20 minutes.
Yes, within the past 20 minutes or so. The president was headed for another speech, and the motorcade was moving along on this freeway, going under a ramp of another freeway when the attack took place.
Here is some information on a speech which he apparently had just made before being shot. President Kennedy lashed out today at those he said who confuse rhetoric with reality. Speaking in an area where supporters are booming Senator Barry Goldwater's chances for the 1964 Republican nomination, Kennedy said that ignorance and misinformation, if allowed to prevail in foreign policy,
Yes, we will.
handicaps this country's
This is Frank
security.
McGee, NBC News. Put Mr. McNeil on, please.
This is Robin McNeil, our correspondent, who has been traveling
Hello,
with the
Bob.
president.
Bob, are you there? This is Frank McGee. Bob, I'm in 5HN. We are on the air. You take it from the top, Bob, and tell us everything that you know, if you would, please, in chronological order. Starting at the very top, unless you have some late information on the president's condition.
Frank, I'm informed you'll have to repeat that we're not hearing.
Bob, I'm sorry, we're having some difficulties with our communication here, and apparently your broadcast, the early part of it, did not get on the air. Would you begin again? Yes, go again, please, Bob.
They're not getting the other end of the conversation,
Bob, I'm
Frank.
sorry.
You'll have to
I'll tell you what,
repeat.
let's do it this way. You speak slowly, and I'll repeat what you say. All right, this is Robert McNeil reporting from Dallas. Now, please go ahead, Bob. Bob is at the hospital in Dallas, where the president has been rushed. The president is seriously wounded. This information comes from Texas Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was with the president. The shots which wounded the president occurred as the motorcade was running through huge crowds in downtown Dallas. The governor of Texas, John Connally, was also hit. The Texas governor was sitting on the far side of the car across from the president. Mrs. Kennedy, who was seated between them, was not wounded. The shots apparently came from a window in a building overlooking the parade route. But about one street back from it, shielded by some trees. Police, who immediately fanned out around the area, interviewed several witnesses who said they saw a man with a gun in the window. Bob informs me that he was in the motorcade. Julian? He says he was able to hear the shots. They stopped, and as the shots rang out, people lining the streets screamed and lay down on the sidewalk and in the street. The motorcade immediately speeded up. And rushed the president straight to the Parkland Memorial Hospital, from which you're speaking now, Bob. And the president was carried in bleeding. Bob, have you any information on how many times or where the president was struck? Bob does not know how many times nor where the president was struck. All he knows is that the president was seriously wounded, and that is the latest information that they have.
You have to think about what you're going to say when you go on
Bob
there.
says he heard 3 shots. Another reporter at the scene says he heard 4. Turning to the Texas governor, Bob, can you tell us how many times or where he may have been? I see, Bob. Now, one further question. Can you tell us anything about the man who was seen with the gun in the window? Has he been placed under a... Put the phone on. They say that he was a white man. Put the phone on. Go ahead. Put the phone on. There were a lot of Negro people around, but the man seen in the window was a white man. What kind of gun was it, Bob? Was it a rifle? The policeman has told Bob that the policeman heard that it was a high-powered rifle, but there's been no confirmation of that. Just a moment, Bob. Please stand by.
Hold on to Bob. I think we have a gadget here, Frank, that...
Put the receiver on that, Frank, and apparently it will function as a speaker. And let Bob talk.
Bob, I'm told that this little thing I've just attached to the telephone... Bob, could you say a few words for us? You're still there. Now, is this being broadcast, what it's saying there now?
That's right.
I see.
Yep.
Bob, I'll tell you what, I realize that you're in a terrible position. You cannot get information as long as you're on the phone, but do you think you would be better advised to remain on the phone or to break the connection and get back in touch with us? Your judgment.
I think I would be better advised. Just a moment.
Yes, Bob. This is being heard, what he is saying.
Yes, Frank.
Over this microphone here.
What's your job, boy?
Hello?
Yes, Bob.
I have a medical student here who's going to hold this line open for me.
All right.
And if you'll just chat with him, I'll ask somebody else to chat with him until I come back in about 5 minutes.
That's fine, Bob. We'll be expecting you, and I'll keep the phone and be talking with the student. We'll know when you come back. Thank you, Bob, very much.
Frank, to interrupt for a moment, there is this from Dallas. While Robin McNeil is on the phone, of course, he is unable to gather information. President Kennedy has been given blood transfusions at Parkland Hospital in an effort to save his life after he and Governor John Connally of Texas were shot in an assassination attempt. The word still is that the president is in very serious condition. Other reports say he is in critical condition. Governor John Connally, I think, Chet, has been moved, has he not?
Yes, we have this information which adds up to something rather inconclusive. It says the Secret Service said the president remained in the emergency room and the governor was moved to the general operating room of Parkland Hospital. One Secret Service man was overheard telling another that there was no need to move the president because emergency facilities were entirely adequate in the emergency room. That would indicate, just sort of a snap judgment evaluation, that Governor Connally was worse wounded than the president. But as I say, that is only a snap judgment evaluation.
Or it could mean, Chet, that they are separating the two cases so that each can be given full attention.
Right.
The medical student who is on the line with me says he can see outside a window and that a sizable crowd has gathered outside the hospital. This telephone line, by the way, is connected to the hospital. What is the name of the hospital?
Parkland Memorial.
Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas, where the president and the governor have been taken. And NBC's Robert McNeil is getting the latest information now and should be getting back on the line with us very shortly.
Again, to repeat, the president and Governor John Connally have been wounded. They were both shot as they rode in a motorcade through Dallas, and each is in serious condition to the best of our knowledge. But there is no more definitive word than that. We may get some now. We are going to switch to station WBAP-TV, Fort Worth, Dallas, and to newsman Charles Murphy.
Well, that's all right.
Just moments ago, authorities in Dallas took a young man into custody. Which was really never held. Is now.
As you can appreciate, communication facilities, as you just saw, went in and out. This is a time of what would probably best be described as controlled panic. The arrangements for that switch to Fort Worth were made entirely hastily under conditions of extreme pressure, and that is why the picture came and the audio didn't, and then when the picture dropped, the audio came in. Again, to recap, to the best of our knowledge at this moment, both President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally have been wounded by an assassination attempt in Dallas, Texas. They were moving in a motorcade through a downtown section of the city. NBC's Robert McNeil has reported from the scene, and he was riding in the motorcade, that Mrs. Kennedy was not injured, although she was riding in the car with the President and Governor Connally sitting between them. Each was hit. There are reports that a white man was seen at the window of a building about a block away from the cars. There are other reports that a man was seen with a high-powered rifle. There is no indication yet that whoever fired the shots at the President and the Texas Governor has been found. The word from Parkland Memorial Hospital is that President Kennedy is being treated in an emergency room of the hospital, that he has received blood transfusions, that he is in critical condition but alive. There is no word on how many times he was struck by bullets or where he sustained the wounds. Now, we are going to attempt once more to return to station WBAP-TV, Fort Worth, Dallas, and newsman Charles Murphy.
There is no definite word yet that the person who fired the shots at President Kennedy and Governor Connally in Dallas has been apprehended. We have just received this report, though. Moments ago, authorities took a young man into custody. They took him to the county sheriff's office near the Triple Overpass, near where the shooting occurred. The man was neatly dressed. He's in his early 20s. He is protesting vehemently his innocence, and he says that he has witnesses to prove that he is innocent. 2 Roman Catholic priests have been summoned to the emergency room where the President is. A White House spokesman said someone had asked for the priest, but did not say whom. Blood transfusions have been administered to President Kennedy. Governor Connally has been moved to the general operating room. Repeating, just moments ago, authorities have taken a young man into custody in Dallas, but there is no definite word that this is the person who might have fired the shots at President Kennedy and Governor Connally. Charles Murphy reporting from WBAP-TV, Fort Worth, Dallas.
These additional details from the hospital in Dallas. Officials at the hospital say the President has been given a transfusion of B-positive blood. They are calling for fresh blood of that type to have it ready if additional transfusions were needed. Mrs. Lyndon Johnson, the wife of the Vice President, was escorted by Secret Service agents into the emergency room where the President is being treated. Now, for Washington reaction to this tragic story, we go to NBC News Washington and David Brinkley.
Bill, there isn't a great deal as yet because obviously the news has just got here. It was taken to Congress, which of course recessed immediately to wait to see what has happened. We've checked with the White House, which has told us it doesn't know any more than we know, and in fact has been listening to us to see what it could find out. The President's brother, Edward Kennedy, Teddy Kennedy, was on the floor of the Senate and was informed of the news by the Senate Democratic leader, Senator Mike Mansfield. The only word beyond that we have is that Senator Kennedy didn't know at the moment whether he would go to Texas or not. Beyond that, again, there is no particular or unexpected reaction here yet because most of Washington has just found out about it and is shocked and stunned along with everyone else. The White House, again, has no more information at the moment than we have. We'll stay here, of course, ready to bring you any at the moment it arrives. In the meantime, we'll switch back to you, Chet, Frank, Bill.
Thank you, David. This seems tangential and hardly important, but it is reported. The stock exchange closed operations after word of the attempt on President Kennedy's life, and the cotton and wool exchanges also closed. Now we are returning to Dallas, Fort Worth, to station WBAP-TV and newsman Tom Whalen. again experiencing difficulties. We will, however, make the switch when we can. Here, again, is what we know so far. President Kennedy has been wounded in an assassination attempt. He is reported in very serious and critical condition. He has been given a blood transfusion. He is being treated at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas, where the attack took place. There are reports in Dallas that a young man has been taken into custody, but there are no indications that he has been charged with anything. He is insisting he had nothing to do with the attempt on the president's life.
Yes, Bob.
Now, for late details, we go to newsman Tom Whalen at WBAP-TV, Fort Worth.
Hang on.
This is Tom Whalen in Fort Worth. WBAP newsman James Darnell in Dallas on the scene of the presidential shooting, the shooting in which President Kennedy and Governor Connally were shot, has an eyewitness interview with a Mrs. Jean Hill. Here is the interview.
What is your name, ma'am?
Jean Hill.
From Dallas?
That's right.
And did you see the shooting, miss?
Yes, sir.
Can you describe what happened?
Yes, sir.
Will you do that now?
They were driving along, and we were the only people in this area on our side, and the shots came from directly across the street from us. And just as the president's car became directly even with us, we took one look at him, and he was sitting there. He and Jackie were looking at a dog that was in the middle of the seat, and about that time, 2 shots rang out just as he looked up. Just as the president looked up, and these 2 shots rang out, and he grabbed his chest, and it looked like he was in pain, and he fell over in the seat, and Jackie fell over on him and said, "My God, he's been shot." And after that, more shots rang out, and the car sped away.
What kind of car was that?
What kind of a car was it? The president's
Well,
car.
I mean, where did the shots come from?
The shots came from the hill.
From a hill?
Yes. It was just east of the underpass.
Uh-huh. And,
We were on the south side.
Could you see, did you look up there where the shots came from, ma'am?
Yes, sir.
Could you see anyone?
I thought I saw this man running, but I looked at the president, and, for a while, and I looked up there, and I thought I saw a man running. And so, right after that, I guess I didn't have any better sense. I started running up there, too.
Uh-huh. And what is your name?
Jean Hill.
G-E-A-N?
J-E-A-N.
And J-E-A-N. What's your address, Miss Hill?
9402 Bluff Creek.
9402 Bluff.
That was an interview I had with Mrs. Jean Hill of Dallas a few minutes ago. A short time later, Dallas sheriff's officers took a young man into custody. It's believed that they also took a rifle at the same time, described as a .30-30 rifle, which was supposedly found near the scene, although this has not been confirmed. And as we reported earlier, both Governor Connally and President Kennedy are in the emergency room. That is, the president is now. Governor Connally was moved to another room in the hospital. A Catholic priest was called to the emergency room a short time ago, and the president's condition is described as very critical. Representative Albert Thomas of Houston said both men were alive, however. This is Tom Whalen reporting from Fort Worth, Texas, concerning the shooting of President Kennedy and Governor Connally of Texas. Stay tuned to NBC for further details.
Now, Frank McGee has reestablished communications with Robert McNeil, who has been traveling with the president. Frank, your report from Robert.
Bob, if you will stand by just a moment until I attach this little device to the earpiece, and then I'll tell you when to go ahead. Please go ahead, Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
Last rites of the Roman Catholic Church have just been administered to President Kennedy.
You can drop the box, Frank. They have it direct, they say. If you can give him Bob a go ahead.
He's going.
He's going. And we're not getting it, so perhaps we'd better go back to the black box. We're not getting it on a direct feed, Frank. We may have to return to that black box.
Bob, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are again experiencing difficulty with the feed. So would you start at the top again, please, Bob, and I'll repeat you as I did the last time.
Freeway. We were headed to the freeway. That's what
The last rites of the Roman Catholic Church have been administered to President Kennedy, who is said to be seriously wounded in a Dallas hospital after being shot at during a motorcade through the city.
Well, if you get that space.
The rites were administered a few moments ago by Father Hubert. They do not necessarily mean that the president's condition is fatal. White House officials say the president's condition is still uncertain. He was carried into the hospital unconscious. From the car in which he and Governor John Connally of Texas were both shot at. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, who was in the rear seat of the open car beside the president, was not hurt. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who was with the president, walked into the hospital. Bob, let me interrupt. Was he in the same car? All right, please, go ahead. Walked into the hospital, holding his own arm. Just a moment, Bob. I'm going to interrupt for a bulletin that the Associated Press has moved from Dallas. Mrs. Lyndon Johnson said after a visit... Yes, please go ahead then, Bob. Who just emerged from the area where the president has been taken, said that her husband, the vice president, is fine. She would not say anything about the condition of President Kennedy, however. She appeared to be in a state of shock and was hurried away by White House personnel. The hospital is reported to be preparing a blood transfusion for both the president and Governor Connally. Bob is telling me that the latest he knows at the moment is that the president's condition is serious and uncertain. That
Or how many times?
we do not know exactly where he was struck nor how many times.
But he was carried into the hospital. Unconscious and bleeding. And last rites of the church have just been administered. That's all for the moment, Frank.
And Bob tells me that's all for the moment. Bob?
Yeah.
If you could make the same arrangement and have
There's this additional detail from the hospital. An assistant to Governor Connally said he talked to the governor in the hospital operating room. He said the governor was shot just below the shoulder blade in the back. The assistant, Bill Stinson, said he asked the governor how it happened, and he said, I don't know. I guess from the back they got the president, too. These are quotes from Governor John Connally, who was also wounded. There are additional reports that the governor's aide asked the governor if there was anything he could do, and all the governor said was just take care of Nellie for me. That is Governor Connally's wife. She was uninjured. Also, Mrs. Kennedy was not injured. As Robert McNeil reported, the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church have been administered to the president, but this in no way indicates that it is expected that he will lose his life. And Chet has something more.
Director J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI has telephoned the Dallas FBI office ordering an all-out investigation of the attempt today on the lives of the President and Governor John Connally of Texas. Here is an item. Both women, meaning Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Connally, disappeared into the emergency section of Parkland Hospital to await news of their husbands. Outside the emergency room in a buff-walled hallway, anxious members of the White House staff gathered, including Major General Chester V. Clifton, military aide to the President, and Brigadier General Godfrey McHugh, the Air Force aide. Mrs. Evelyn Lincoln, the President's secretary, Pamela Tenure, press secretary to Mrs. Kennedy, and other members of the staff were shown to a special waiting room not far from the emergency room area where the President was lying. As Frank McGee has reported on direct word from our correspondent in Dallas, a crowd is gathering outside Parkland Hospital in Dallas.
There's also this, Chet, repeating what we got from Fort Worth, that sheriff's officers have taken a young man into custody and are questioning him, but there is no indication that any charges have been placed against him. There is no indication that he is directly involved in this attempt on the life of President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally.
Bill, I think we have a picture of the President and Mrs. Kennedy as they arrived in Dallas this morning, and I have some fragmentary copy on the first speech which the President delivered in Dallas. This is a picture of the President and Mrs. Kennedy.
I think the camera that has you, Chet, is the one that would have to get the picture.
I'll hold it up over here. This is a picture of the first family, or the President and Mrs. Kennedy, rather, arriving in Dallas only a couple of hours before the assassination attempt. The first speech that the President delivered in Dallas, speaking in an area where supporters are booming Senator Barry Goldwater's chances for the Republican nomination, the President said that ignorance and misinformation, if allowed to prevail in foreign policy, handicaps the country's security. This was a speech prepared for the Dallas Citizens Council, the Dallas Assembly, and the Graduate Research Center of the Southwest. He did not specifically mention Senator Goldwater by name. The President said, in a world of complex and continuing problems, in a world full of frustrations and irritations, America's leadership must be guided by the lights of learning and reason, or else those who confuse rhetoric with reality and the plausible with the possible will gain the ascendancy with their seemingly swift and simple solutions to every world problem.
Chet, there's also this. In Washington, the two president's brothers, his two brothers, Attorney General Robert Kennedy and his younger brother, Senator Edward Kennedy, are on their way to Andrews Air Force Base. They will fly to Dallas. Additional details from the hospital. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has not been injured in this attack on President Kennedy and Texas Governor Connally. The Vice President is somewhere in the same hospital where the President is being treated, Parkland Memorial in Dallas. It is reported he is badly shocked by the shooting, that doctors are trying to keep him as quiet as possible, and that he is under heavy Secret Service and police protection. It's also noted that throughout the trip in Texas, when the President and the Vice President have been in the same motorcade, they have been kept in separate cars, a precaution against just such an attempt as was obviously made today. Chet?
I referred a moment ago and read an excerpt from the speech which President Kennedy delivered to a breakfast crowd this morning, earlier. The breakfast crowd of 2,200 people rose in ovation after the speech, and a few minutes later, the President said he felt like he did in France 2 years ago when he identified himself as the man who accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. Do you have anything else, Frank?
Yes, there was just excuse me just a moment, John. There was just word from the hospital that they have dispatched a call for a neurosurgeon, which I understand would indicate that one of the two had been hit in the head, would it not?
Or either the head or possibly some spinal damage. There is also this, understandably, in a situation like this, the information comes in fragments and comes from unexpected places and uncontrolled angles. Senator Ralph Yarborough, Texas Democrat, who was in a nearby car when the attack took place on the President, said he saw the President's lips moving at what he called a normal rate of speed while Mr. Kennedy was being rushed to the hospital. How much it means, we do not know.
There's further word from the hospital, Bill, that they're trying to make arrangements as quickly as they can for a press conference where as much actual and detailed information as they have can be disseminated.
And there is word here, Frank, that at least one neurosurgeon has arrived at the hospital. I should imagine in a case such as this that virtually every medical specialist of any sort and description and capability would be called into the hospital so that all medical treatment would be available to the President. Chet?
In just this momentary lull, I would assume that the memory of every person listening at this moment has flashed back to that day in April 1945 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt...
Excuse me, Chet. Here is a flash from the Associated Press, Dateline Dallas. Two priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. There is no further confirmation, but this is what we have on a flash basis from the Associated Press. Two priests in Dallas who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. There is no further confirmation. This is the only word we have indicating that the President may, in fact, have lost his life. It has just moved on the Associated Press wires from Dallas. The two priests were called to the hospital to administer the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church, and it is from them we get the word that the President has died, that the bullet wounds inflicted on him as he rode in a motorcade through downtown Dallas have been fatal. We would remind you there is no official confirmation of this from any source as yet.
Bill, just moments before you brought the flash, I had word from the hospital that the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, and his wife had just left the hospital, been rushed away into a motorcade and departed.
This, Frank, might be confirmation of the flash.
We must stand by for confirmation, as Bill has emphasized. This is rather sketchy information. We will stand by. We should have.
Now, there apparently is word that this AP flash, this report from the two priests, that the president has died of bullet wounds, is confirmed. We will attempt now to get to station WBAP-TV in Fort Worth, Dallas for confirmation. We go to newsman Tom Murphy.
Substantiating this, but not confirming it, is a report about 5 minutes ago by the Dallas Police Department to all of its officers that the president had died. Some 3 to 5 minutes later, the AP flashed that two priests at the hospital say the president is dead. Charles Murphy, returning now to NBC in New York.
Word from two sources. Again, it is not...
Bill, excuse me. We have NBC's Bob McNeil on the line now with a report. Please go ahead, Bob. White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff has just announced that President Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time, which is about 35 minutes ago.
After being shot at.
After being shot.
By an unknown assailant.
By an unknown assailant.
During a motorcade drive through downtown Dallas.
During a motorcade drive through downtown Dallas.
The president died.
The president died.
Approximately 25 minutes.
Approximately 25 minutes.
After the attack took place.
After the attack took place.
He had been rushed, bleeding and unconscious.
He had been rushed, bleeding and unconscious.
To the Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas.
To the Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas.
And was given blood transfusions.
And was given blood transfusions.
About 15 minutes ago.
About 15 minutes ago, reports NBC's Bob McNeil from Dallas, to whom I'm talking now.
A priest emerged.
A priest emerged.
After having given the president.
After having given the president.
The last rites.
The last rites.
Just before the announcement of the president's death was made.
Just before the announcement of the president's death was made.
Vice President Lyndon Johnson.
Vice President Lyndon Johnson.
Emerged grim-faced.
Emerged grim-faced.
And was driven off with a police escort.
And was driven away with a police escort.
To assume. The constitutional responsibilities.
The constitutional responsibilities.
Of the presidency.
Of the presidency.
A casket.
A casket.
Has just been brought into the emergency ward.
Has just been brought into the emergency ward.
Of this hospital.
Of this hospital.
For President Kennedy.
For President Kennedy.
The attack took place.
The attack took place.
As the president was just completing.
As the president was just completing.
What amounted to. A triumphal drive.
A triumphal drive.
Through downtown Dallas.
Through downtown Dallas.
Encountering the biggest.
Encountering the largest.
And in some ways the most friendly crowds.
And in some ways the most friendly crowds.
Of his two-day Texas tour.
Of his two-day Texas tour.
Dallas police.
Dallas police.
Had put into effect.
The
most stringent security precautions in the city's history.
The most stringent security precautions in the city's history.
Because they had anticipated. There might be some demonstrations. Against President Kennedy. Like those which marked the visit.
Similar to those which marked the visit
of UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson. On October 24th. Mrs. Kennedy. Who was sitting beside the president. In the open car. Was not hurt. However, the governor of Texas. John Connally. Who was also in the car. Was wounded reportedly in the chest. And more blood.
Repeat, Bob.
Further supplies of blood. For transfusions for the governor. Have just been brought into the hospital. The shooting came. According to witnesses. from the second floor of a building called the Texas School Book Depository. Which is about 100 yards. From the tree-lined parkway. On which the president was driving when the shooting occurred. 3 shots were heard. Frank, that's about all I can tell you at the moment.
Bob, thank you very much. We'll keep the line open.
Okay, we'll keep the line open.
That was a report from NBC's Robert McNeil at the hospital in Dallas, Texas, confirming by way of word from the White House press secretary that President Kennedy is dead.
The death, according to Malcolm Kilduff, who was acting as the president's secretary on this trip, came roughly 39 minutes ago at about 1 o'clock Dallas time. There is further word that Vice President Lyndon Johnson was taken from the hospital and he was not wounded. He has been taken from the hospital off to a secluded place. He will assume the constitutional duties, succeeding now the late John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the former president, the late president of the United States.
So that is the story. The President of the United States is dead. The new President of the United States is Lyndon Johnson. Mrs. Kennedy, we understand, is still at the hospital. She was not hurt. The White House spokesmen have refused to comment on her condition. President Johnson is under heavy guard and was whisked away from the hospital by White House officials. President Kennedy, we are now informed, was shot in the right temple. It was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head, said Dr. George Berkeley, the White House medical officer.
Chet, we have more details, once again reestablishing contact with our station in Fort Worth, Dallas. And so, for additional information, we go to station WBAP-TV, Fort Worth, Dallas, and newsman Charles Murphy.
The car wanted in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy has been stopped in Fort Worth. Police report that the suspect in the shooting is in custody. Further word will come later. Fort Worth is 30 miles west of Dallas. Just a few minutes before this report, we heard from one of our newsmen in Dallas on the scene, James Kerr, who said that a Dallas policeman, J.D. Tippett, was shot to death by an unknown man in a car minutes after the president and Governor Connally were shot. The officer was shot about 2 miles from the scene of the presidential assassination. Repeating the first of this bulletin, the car wanted in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy has been stopped in Fort Worth. At an intersection, police reported that they had the suspect in the shooting on the ground. We hope further confirmation will come on this momentarily. This is Charles Murphy reporting from WBAP-TV, Fort Worth, Dallas.
Now, we have ready for you an eyewitness account of the assassination of President Kennedy. This was recorded, and the voice you will hear is that of an NBC sound man traveling with one of our television camera crews in the presidential trip to Texas. The sound is the voice of John Hofen.
Yes, Bob.
This is John Hofen of the NBC White House news crew traveling with the president in Dallas, Texas. We had just driven through the downtown section of Dallas, through the business area where the president had received a very tumultuous welcome. We're approaching a drive which would put us on a freeway where we would then drive to the Trademark, where the president was to attend a luncheon and make a speech by our Dallas citizens. As we turned down this moderate curve here, there was a loud shot. At first we thought it was a cherry bomb by some teenager. Then it was immediately followed by 2 and 3 more. Everybody sort of ducked, and there were people falling to the ground. We did not know who was shot. Ladies and men both were screaming. David Wigman, the cameraman in the car in which I was riding, immediately jumped out, was making pictures. We did not know who was hurt. When the president's car took off with the police escort and the Secret Service and a mad dash, which turned out to be towards the hospital. We picked up one of the remaining Secret Service men who had been left behind. He went with us in a mad frenzy in this motorcade behind the president's car. We were cleared through the police lines and finally got to the hospital. As we came down the final drive there behind the emergency entrance, we were told that we could not go any further, and we stayed outside and were kept informed by Malcolm Kilduff, the Associate News Secretary on the President's staff, of what was happening. As I left the hospital to come over here to this phone, which is approximately a block away, he whispered in my ear, he says, "John, we understand the president has died. Since waiting here on the phone, they have made announcements that he has died."
That was the recorded voice of John Hofen, an NBC sound man who was traveling with a television film unit in the presidential motorcade and who witnessed the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, Frank McGee, who has been keeping an open telephone line to the Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, where President Kennedy died, is once again in touch with the NBC correspondent who was traveling with the president, Robert McNeil. Here now, Frank and his communications with McNeil.
Yes, Bob, I understand that they're clearing the room, so would you give us a report on what you can see from there now?
Well, President Kennedy's body, Frank,
President Kennedy's body?
is in the emergency section.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bob. I understand you can be heard directly now, so go right ahead with a straight report.
President Kennedy's body is in the emergency section of this hospital at the end of a long corridor. For the past 45 minutes, the corridor has been filled with bewildered-looking White House officials, hospital interns, reporters. Now police are clearing out the entire corridor, and we believe that the president's body is about to be brought out. A bronze coffin was taken in about 15 minutes ago, and that was shortly after White House Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff had officially announced that the president died at 1 o'clock Dallas time, that is 2 o'clock New York time, after the shooting incident in downtown Dallas.
Bob, thank you very much. Does this mean you will have to leave this telephone?
I can hold on for a second here, Frank, I think.
Well, please do.
I'll hold on as long as I can.
Yes, as long as you can. And that's the word from Dallas, Bill, at this time.
Thank you very much, Frank. Merrill Muller, I think you have some additional detail here.
The flag at the White House has just been lowered to half-mast. We also have 2 eyewitness reports on the wire services. One eyewitness reporter, a television reporter named Mal Couch, said that he saw a gun emerging from the window of a warehouse. This warehouse was located just beyond a triple underpass through which the presidential motorcade had to go on its way into downtown Dallas. And just as the car emerged from the presidential car emerged from this underpass, 3 shots rang out. 3, not 2. We know that Mr. Kennedy was hit in the right temple and that Governor Connally was hit in the head and wrist. That's all we know at the moment on Governor Connally. We do not have a late report on his condition. As you know, the president died just about an hour ago from his wounds. This is the first assassination of a president of the United States since William McKinley, I think, in 19...
Well, here's something on Governor Connally. He's reported in satisfactory condition.
This is just in, as Bill just told you, Governor Connally is in satisfactory condition. We have no report on the condition of Mrs. Kennedy. She is in the hospital still.
Bob, we have a still photograph here in the studio that has just moved, and it shows a man and a woman and what looks like 2 small children lying on the ground. I understand you saw these people.
Yes, well, they were the first people I went to. I must have got there shortly before that picture was taken, when I jumped out of the press bus, and they, in common with many other people, were screaming and lying down in the grass to escape from the shooting. The minute the shooting sound started, the air was filled with the screams of women and children. A sort of very feminine wailing filled the air, and everybody lay down on the sidewalks, on the grass, on the edge of the parkway, and I assume that the picture you're talking about is that, because nobody else I know was besides Kennedy and Governor Connally.
We lost a part of that. You say, as far as you know, no one else.
As far as I know, no one else was hit other than President Kennedy and Governor Connally.
Now, Bob, again, about the area or the building from which the shot apparently was fired. Could you describe that for us and tell us about how far away it was from the car and how they would have been able to see the car from that distance?
Yes, well, I'll describe the scene. There was, as you come out of the main street of downtown Dallas, which was packed with people, it leads into a parkway called the Triple Underpass. And that parkway, which is lined with trees and lawns, takes a bend. And behind some trees in the sort of service road is a brick building of about 8 stories, which is called the Texas School Book Depository.
I see. So
according to witnesses, 2 of them who I talked to and the police talked to, say they saw a man with a gun in the one said the second floor, another one said the fourth floor, a window of that building. Now, from either floor, Frank, he would be able to see over the low trees to about 100 yards away where the president's car was.
An unobstructed view, Bob?
I would think so. I was not able to go up to either of those windows, so I couldn't see for myself, but looking at it from the ground, it looked as though it would be. The president, therefore, must have had presented either a profile to the assailant, if he was, in fact, in those windows where the witnesses say, or his three-quarter back, because his car had actually passed the direct line from the window. You see, the way it went is the car would have approached the window head-on, then turned left and gone down a slight decline under the underpass. Just a moment, Frank.
Yes, Bob. That seems to fit, Bill, with what he said. The word that we had here was the president was struck in the right temple. Yes, Bob.
The body has just been carried out.
Go ahead. Say again, Bob.
The president's body has just been carried out of the hospital in the bronze casket, and it was accompanied by his military aide, Major General Clifton.
And
it has been placed in an ambulance. I understand it is being taken straight to the air base where he landed to be flown back to Washington.
I see, Bob.
The crowds have all been moved away from the door by the local police and the Secret Service. I can hear the motorcycle escort outside with the ambulance starting up. And the president's body, with the police motorcycle escort, is now pulling away from the hospital. It is about 1.5 hours since he was shot. The president has been dead for about 1 hour and 7 minutes. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who is now constitutionally the president, left immediately after the president's death was confirmed, and with a police escort went off to the airport, presumably to go straight to Washington to assume the constitutional responsibilities of the president.
Bob, returning to your earlier narrative, you had just taken us to the point where the president's car had turned, and I was about to ask.
Now, there were 3 cars behind him with Secret Service and several Texas congressmen, and then I was in the first press bus, at the front of the first press bus, which came behind those. And just as we turned the corner, about 40 feet behind the president's car, I heard 3 shots.
Now, Bob, was the president seated or standing at that time?
The president was seated because there were very few people at that point. It was a thin crowd at that exact point. Most of the crowd had been concentrated a few hundred yards back. The president was seated, Mrs. Kennedy was seated, but when I heard shots, I saw people fall to the ground and was not looking for the moment at the president. The car immediately disappeared under the underpass and speeded up to go straight to the hospital. And I left the press bus and went to this building from which the shots reportedly came.
Mm-hmm. What sort of a building is it, Bob?
Well, it is I told you the title. It's the Texas School Book Depository. It's a orangey brick building of about 8 floors, and it was showing an expanse to the street of maybe about 8 windows wide in the front.
Well, Bob, from the point where they think the man with the gun might have been seen to where the president was actually felled, would it have been possible for him to have been struck by a bullet in the right temple? That's his
I believe that if he was using a high-powered rifle with a telescopic sight, one policeman told me he understood it was a high-powered rifle. I don't know about the telescopic sight. I assume that from that distance it could be.
I see. About how fast was the president's motorcade going at the time of the
slowly.
firing?
It was about, by that time, having just gone around the corner, it was probably between 15 and 20 miles an hour.
Mm-hmm. And Vice President Lyndon Johnson was how far behind?
I'm not sure, Frank, which car. There was a jumble of congressmen in the car immediately behind, and I'm not sure which car Vice President Johnson was in.
And then you say, of course, that the motorcade speeded up immediately and rushed toward the hospital.
And disappeared under the underpass, and I had jumped out by that time and was running with the police. They thought the assailant had fled over some railroad tracks, and they chased him through what they thought was the assailant, through several trains. Standing on the tracks, and I went with them, and therefore didn't see the president immediately as he went under the underpass.
Well, did they apprehend this person they were chasing?
No, they apprehended nobody at that time. They went back and started talking to witnesses on the scene.
I see.
We now have more reports from the area where it happened, so we returned to station WBAP-TV in Fort Worth and newsman Tom Whalen.
Here's an additional report on what you heard NBC correspondent Bob Abernathy describe a few minutes ago, the building in which the sniper had hidden. It's the Texas School Depository at the intersection of Elm and Houston Street in Dallas. Dallas Crime Laboratory Lieutenant J.C. Day went to the building a short time after the shooting took place, and he walked out with a British .303 rifle. The rifle has a telescopic sight. Now, the rifle was found on the 6th floor of the building near a corner window. Also, police searching that area found 3 empty .303 cartridge cases, also scraps of chicken, as if a person could have been there for some time. There were boxes of books, textbooks, and other school materials stacked up all around on 3 sides of a sniper's nest, as if he had been there for some time. There was a gun rest made of papers near the open window that commanded the site from which the sniper, by which the presidential motorcade passed when the president and Governor Connally was shot. We also have another eyewitness account, Charles Bren of Dallas, who was probably the last man to view the president from the street as the motorcade sped away. Here is Charles Bren's report.
Hello. Jimmy? Where's your witness?
Brem, I understand you were a witness to the incident here. Yes, sir. Unfortunately, I was probably 15 to 20 feet away from the president when it happened. Tell us exactly what you saw, sir. He was coming down the street, and my 5-year-old boy and myself were by ourselves on the grass there on Palmer Street, and I asked Joe to wave to him, and Joe waved, and I waved, and the man... That's all right, sir. You waved. As he was waving back, the shot rang out, and he slumped down in the seat. And his wife reached up toward him, and he was slumping down, and the second shot went off, and it just knocked him down from the seat. The 2 shots. Did you see the man who did this? No, sir, I did not see the man who did it. All I did was look in the man's face when he was shot there, and saw that expression on his face, and grabbed himself and slide. And the second one, whenever it went, why, I'm positive it had hit him. I hope it didn't, but I'm positive it had hit him, and he went all the way down in the car. Then they speeded up, and I didn't know what was going on, so I just grabbed the boy and fell on him and hoped that there wasn't a maniac around. I'm sorry. I can't help you more, but I won't forget. Yes. Thank you very much.
As we said before, the sniper's nest has been found, and police have recovered a British .303 rifle with a telescopic sight. This is Tom Whalen reporting from Texas for NBC from WBAP-TV.
Things can move this fast when you are dealing with a story of this magnitude, even while we were getting reports from Fort Worth, Dallas, on finding the sniper's nest and details of what was going on in that building from which the bullets were fired. We were handed another story here from Dallas, and Frank has that.
Well, it's to the effect that a Secret Service agent and a Dallas policeman have been shot and killed some distance away from the area where President Kennedy was assassinated, and no other information was immediately available.
Now, there was an earlier report, Frank, from WBAP-TV that a Dallas policeman had been shot to death approximately 2 miles from the scene where the assassination of President Kennedy took place.
This seems to be the same policeman, but that a Secret Service agent was killed in addition.
Also, in the earlier reports, we were told that a car that was wanted in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy had been stopped in Fort Worth, and that a suspect had been picked up. Now, we have had no further word on that, no indication whether the police have or feel they have captured the person or persons who took part in this successful attempt on the life of President Kennedy. Now, we are starting to get conflicting reports on weapons. There was one that it was a .303 rifle, and that 3 spent .303 cartridges were found on the 5th floor of this building, along with some remnants of chicken, indicating that the sniper staked himself out for quite a while before firing the fatal shot today. Now there is another word that a Mauser has been found, 7.65 Mauser. It's a German Army rifle which had a telescopic sight, with 1 shell left in the chamber. 3 spent shells were found nearby. What this means, whether this is the weapon or the other, we do not know. Possibly the Mauser is measured in millimeters and might come close to being a .303, Frank.
Might well be. I would expect certainly that during these early and confusing moments of this thing, we're likely to get conflicting reports. It's of no consequence in the final analysis. The president is dead, has been shot. I'm sure that all of us from time to time have wondered if it is really necessary to go to the great lengths that the Secret Service does go to in trying to protect the life of the President of the United States. Each infinite detail is checked out. I would assume, but I think it's a safe assumption, that the driver of the automobile, who was a Secret Service man, knew instantly where the nearest hospital in Dallas was located. And the reports we have received from there say that he sped away immediately and went directly to the hospital in an effort to spare the president first from further gunfire, and secondly, of course, to get him to the hospital as quickly as possible. But despite the inconvenience and the annoyance that is connected with the Secret Service effort to protect the life of the President of the United States, it still comes as a tremendous shock to us to realize that a thing like this can happen in our country, and with the precautions that are made. One of those who was a witness to the assassination today and was a member of the presidential party was Texas Senator Ralph Yarbrough, and he went to the hospital when the president was taken there and was the first to give newsmen anxiously awaiting in corridors outside some indication of what the president's condition might be. This is a picture, I think, if we can get it here on our frame, of the Texas senator at the hospital as he came out and tried to talk with the newsmen. Everyone was shocked and broken up, and he quite obviously is under some stress and strain, appears to be in tears. Texas Senator Ralph Yarbrough.
Frank, in speaking of precautions taken in presidential motorcades, the security, the attempts to protect them from any possible attack, I have ridden in those motorcades, and you have too, and I'm sure you realize that total protection is just completely impossible.
As they realize this, well, if one stops and thinks, here you have a distance of maybe 15 or 20 miles, and the person that you're trying to protect is in an open automobile. Quite frequently, he is standing and waving. The distance from his arrival point to his destination, as I say, could be 15 miles. You can have hundreds, literally hundreds of thousands, and on occasion millions of people lining these streets. There are hundreds and hundreds of buildings on either side where an assassin could attempt to conceal himself. So in a very real sense, it is an impossible thing to give complete and total protection to the President of the United States. Wasn't even attempted, as a matter of fact, prior to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. We had no Secret Service.
We have further reaction, Frank, from overseas on the loss of President Kennedy. West Germany's Chancellor Ludwig Erhard said the news fills the German people with deep grief. Again from Rome, Cardinal McIntyre of Los Angeles, Cardinal Ritter of St. Louis called together the student priests of Rome's North American College to recite prayers for the late president. Cardinal McIntyre said Cardinal Ritter and myself were having dinner when we heard the news, astounding news of President Kennedy's death. And Cardinal McIntyre said, we are shocked, grief-stricken, and our hearts are pained.
The flag has been lowered at the White House. The acting White House press secretary, Malcolm Kilduff, he is acting in the absence of Pierre Salinger, who is in a jet plane out over the Pacific. He, along with 4 members of the president's cabinet, was on his way to Japan for a meeting. When the news reached them about a half hour ago, the plane turned around and headed back toward Hawaii and then back toward Washington. Kilduff said the president's body would be flown to Washington this afternoon. Senator Edward Kennedy, the president's brother, and Mrs. Sergeant Shriver, his sister, that's Eunice Kennedy, arrived at the White House a few minutes ago. From there, they took a helicopter to Andrews Air Force Base, which is a few miles outside of town. From there, they will take a jet plane to fly to Dallas to join Mrs. Kennedy. The Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, was at home in Virginia having lunch when the news came. He lives a mile or so outside the city limits. He came back into town and is leaving, or has left, for the airport also to fly to Texas. The government has been closed down. Congress has adjourned. The 4 members of the cabinet, as I say, who were over the Pacific have turned back. Some of the comments from members of the Senate betray the same shock and horror expressed by everyone else on hearing the news. For example, Mike Mansfield, the Democratic leader of the Senate, when the news came to him, said he was a man who contributed so much and deserved so much more in return. Senator Bible of Nevada said it's one of the great tragedies of our lifetime, and the world has lost a great champion in the United States, a courageous president. And Senator Byrd of Virginia said he was deeply shocked. It's a disaster, and he could not find words to express his distress. There are similar sentiments expressed by everyone who has said anything at all. The Secret Service, which normally is stationed, the Secret Service, which is charged with protecting the president, physically protecting him, is a plainclothes civilian arm of the United States Treasury, which is just next door to the White House, to the left of the picture you're seeing. They are the husky, muscular young men you see in the news pictures. When the president's motorcade is moving at slow speed in a street or a parade, they usually walk along or run along beside it. They are aware that it is impossible. You see a crowd is gathering across the street. That's Lafayette Park, facing the front entrance to the White House. A crowd is gathered over there for no particular reason, because there is nothing anybody can do. But crowds usually do gather there in moments of crisis. That is, of course, the White House flag at half-staff, lowered as soon as the news came. The Secret Service tries to guard him as best it can, very often by keeping their own bodies in line of any weapon that may be aimed at the president. But obviously they can't cover every window or every tree or every manhole, and they rely primarily on the decency and the good sense of the American people. That, again, is NBC's live television camera on the White House lawn, looking through the iron picket fence across Pennsylvania Avenue to Lafayette Park, named for the Marquis de Lafayette, whose statue is there, and people are beginning to gather there. These are the grounds of the White House, the West Executive Wing, where the president's office is, and where a few minutes ago George Reedy, who is a close associate of Lyndon Johnson, arrived. Didn't say anything, but we assume he came to help make arrangements for the changeover of administration. We don't know specifically yet that Lyndon Johnson has been sworn in, has officially taken the oath, but whether or not he has, he soon will, and whether or not he has, he's president anyway, because that's how the Constitution spells it out. He will, of course, serve out the remainder of Mr. Kennedy's term until January of '64. Beyond that, we don't know.
We are now going to go to an NBC mobile unit, which is outside the NBC building here in New York, for pictures and sounds of the reaction of citizens of this city to the loss of their president. We go to NBC reporter Jeff Pond.
We're on the street outside the NBC studios in Rockefeller Center. Sir, how did you hear of the president's assassination?
A gentleman came into an office in which I was transacting business and mentioned it to us, and at the time I really wasn't able to believe it. I had to hear it for myself, and unfortunately I did very shortly afterwards.
What is your feeling now?
I'm terribly shocked and saddened by it, and I would add angered by it.
Why angered?
I think it was a horrible, senseless thing, and I hope that the rest of the country feels the same way.
Do you think that this assassination somehow reflects a climate of opinion in the country now?
I hope that it doesn't reflect a climate of opinion that is very prevalent in the country today. It certainly obviously reflects an opinion that some people hold. I hope that as an American and the other people as Americans do not generally hold this feeling.
You said some people. Who do you mean by that?
I don't feel expert enough to express an opinion, but the only evidence that I have as to who these people are these ultra-conservative groups that have been distributing literature and spreading hate in Texas, and who attacked Ambassador Stevenson was about a week ago.
A little longer than that. Of course, no one knows if these people are indeed responsible.
No, certainly not.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, what was your reaction?
I was very shocked and saddened by the president's death. I was getting some eyeglasses fitted when I first heard about it, and then I was riding on the bus when they finally told me he was dead.
Do you find it difficult to believe even now?
I really do. I really find it difficult to believe now.
The president was in Dallas, which is, of course, part of the South. Do you think that somehow his racial policies are in any way connected with this?
That's the first thing I thought of when I heard about it, yes. I thought that probably some segregationist crackpot or something, just they had it all planned out, and I really believe that his blood will be on their hands forever, yes.
Thank you. How about you, sir? Do you believe it even now?
This is the first time in my life I honestly say I'm not proud to be an American. Right now I'm serving in the armed forces and I'm just home on leave, and it's an understatement to say it was a shot. I first did not believe it, and I have trouble believing it now. I just don't think it reflects the thinking of most people. As was stated before, I think it's a small minority, and it's just an unfortunate day for the United States that this can happen. This is something that you read in history books and just never want to believe that can happen when you're living.
Do you think this in some way reflects on the security arrangements that the Secret Service?
There are random samplings, what are called man-in-the-street interviews, people here in New York City, their reactions to the loss of the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, who died approximately an hour and 45 minutes ago in Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, after being fatally wounded by a sniper. Developments in the nation's capital reported now by NBC's David Brinkley in Washington.
Bill, we've reported this before, but we will report again that the President's body is expected to arrive at Andrews Air Force Base, a few miles outside of Washington, at about 5:30 Washington time, which is about an hour and 40 minutes from now. The church bells all over town are ringing. We're told that people are standing on street corners, crying openly and freely. NBC's Robert Abernathy reports from Andrews Base that the base commander says the President's body, again, will be arriving at 5:30. He also says that Senator Edward Kennedy and his sister, Mrs. Shriver, who was Eunice Kennedy, have just taken off by jet for Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts. We assume then they are going to their home state to join their mother, father, and other members of the Kennedy family. We also are told that military officers who have the job of arranging state funerals are at the White House now and presumably making the plans. Mr. Kennedy is the first president to die in office since the Defense Department was set up and these arrangements were made. And I think there is no set standard ritual to be followed, so to some extent it will have to be made up. Presumably the Army will be in charge of the arrangements, as it always has been, and it has, of course, caissons and ceremonial horses at Fort Myer, Virginia, which is nearby, along with honor guards of troops who presumably will be used. That is about all we have here at the moment. Richard Valeriani of NBC News is at the White House, as is our mobile unit with a live picture, so we'll switch there and see what's happening. Richard?
The American flag atop the White House here in Washington has been lowered to half-mast. It came down shortly afterward. There was confirmation of the President's death in Dallas. In the White House itself, the President's two children are still there, Caroline and John Jr. We do not know yet if they have been informed of their father's death. We don't know either if there are any of the cabinet members here right now. The two ranking members of the presidential staff were Ted Sorensen and McGeorge Bundy, two of the President's aides. The picture of the flag flying at half-mast, as seen through the trees stripped of their leaves, captures the mood of grimness here at the White House. Outside in front of the White House, crowds have begun to gather, waiting for, they probably don't know quite what, perhaps looking for some visual confirmation of what they and everybody else find so hard to believe, that the President is indeed dead, the victim of an assassin's bullet in Dallas. Police have roped off one side of Pennsylvania Avenue. They are allowing pedestrians to walk in front of the White House, but not to congregate there. Extra police details have been sent and have to contain the crowds outside the White House and to surround the White House on all sides. Traffic is moving normally, and there are no other changes.
No one could ever have believed or dreamed that a president so young would not conclude his term of office, that death would interrupt. There is very little else to report here in Washington, just the general reactions from... Oh, and a bulletin has just come in from Dallas. A sniper armed with a high-powered rifle murdered President Kennedy today, according to the Associated Press Dispatch. Oh, here barely 2 hours after Kennedy's death, Lyndon Johnson has taken the oath of office as the 37th President of the United States. So it is President Lyndon Baines Johnson, 55 years old, the new President of the United States. Now, back to New York.
Here are details on the swearing-in of Lyndon B. Johnson as President of the United States. The oath was administered in Dallas at 1:38 Central Standard Time. That would be roughly an hour and 20 minutes ago, by a federal district judge, Sarah T. Hughes. President Johnson took the oath aboard the presidential plane at Love Field in Dallas as he prepared to fly to Washington to take over the presidency. This is the oath that was administered to Mr. Johnson. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will do the best of my ability to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That is all we know about the swearing-in of Lyndon Johnson as the 36th President of the United States. Mr. Kennedy's predecessor, General Eisenhower, has issued this statement here in New York on the assassination of the President. Quote, I share the sense of shock and dismay that all Americans feel at the despicable act that resulted in the death of our nation's President. Mrs. Eisenhower and I also join with all other citizens in expressing our personal grief and prayerful concern to Mrs. Kennedy and all other members of the family. And now for a late report from Fort Worth, Dallas. We go to station WBAP-TV and newsman Charles Murphy.
Here now are late, unedited, unscreened films of the shooting scene in Dallas. This was a scene near the Stemmons Expressway. This is in front of City Hall in downtown Dallas, a mile east of the shooting scene. Heavy crowds line the downtown streets to view the presidential party. As in all of the Texas stops, there were many teenagers attracted there by the First Lady and the President. This is Main Street in Dallas. Is this moving west? This is moving west toward the fatal moment. The motorcade is traveling at about 20 to 25 miles an hour, slowly westward down Main Street in the heart of Dallas. The time, about 12:20. During the noon hour, heavy crowds from downtown offices lining the route. That looks like the school depository building on the right. I'm not sure. This is the scene of confusion. Something has happened here. The cameraman running toward the scene to the presidential car ahead of him. We caught just a blurred glance of the old school depository building from which the sniper fired the shot. This is the reaction from the crowd. All is confusion at the scene. Here a woman shelters herself. Now racing toward the hospital. On Stemmons Freeway, past the trademark to the right where the president was to have spoken, where he was to have criticized the fanatical right. There, a picket. That is Parkland Hospital, 1.5 miles to 2 miles from the shooting scene. Parkland Hospital, where the president died in Dallas. By the time these films were shot, of course, the presidential car was already at the hospital. This is Major General Clifton, the military aide of the president. press secretary going into the hospital. These pictures, this is General Clifton. This is the emergency room entrance of Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Polaroid picture taken by another witness, Mary Norman of Dallas, showing the president slumped over in the car.
Just as Mary started to take the picture and the president came right even with us, we looked at him and he was looking at a dog in the middle of the seat. 2 shots rang out and he grabbed his chest and a look of pain on his face and fell across toward Jackie, and she fell over on him and said, "My God, he's shot." And there was an interval, and then 3 or 4 more shots rang out. By that time, the motorcade had sped away.
What prompted you to take the picture at that particular instant, ma'am?
Well, that's the only chance I had. Mine is a Polaroid, and I can only take one every 10 seconds, and it was at that time whenever I took it.
Did you know he was shot?
No, I didn't. I must have snapped it immediately when he slumped, because in the picture, that's the way she's there, and he slumped over. And
did you see, were you a witness, did you see the person who fired the...
No, I didn't see any person fire the weapon.
You only heard it?
I only heard it, and I looked up and saw a man running up this hill.
Could you tell me, you had no idea?
No, I had no idea. I had nothing to go by. I mean, I don't think it dawned on me for an instant that the president had been shot. I mean, I knew, and yet it just didn't register.
Did you get a look at the fact?
No, I had taken the picture and then the shots, and I decided it was time to fall on the ground.
You did fall on the ground.
Mary Norman was the woman who took the picture on the right. The other woman was a companion, Jean Hill. Late word just in from Dallas. Homicide detective Lavelle told WBAP newsman James Kerr in Dallas a few minutes ago they have little doubt that 24-year-old Lee Oswald of Dallas is the man who shot and killed Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit shortly after President Kennedy was shot to death this afternoon. Oswald was pulled screaming and shouting from the Texas theater by officers who had gone there on a tip that Oswald was there. He brandished a pistol which officers took away from him after a struggle. Oswald was quoted as saying, "It's all over now." A large crowd had congregated around the theater, and police had to hold back the crowds because they were of the impression that the man was the president's assassin. Officer Tipper had been killed by a man answering the description of Oswald in the neighborhood a short time before. The coincidence in the case is that Oswald worked as a stockman at the Texas Book Depository, the building from which the sniper shot President Kennedy. Dallas police have declined to say whether they think Oswald is connected with the assassination. This other late word in, a 24-year-old man who said 2 years ago he wanted Russian citizenship was questioned today to see whether he had any connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. He was identified as Lee Harvey Oswald of Fort Worth. He was pulled screaming and yelling from the Texas Theater in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas shortly after a Dallas policeman was shot to death.
Yes, Frank. You mentioned a while ago that this federal judge, Sarah Hughes, is that correct?
Yes,
who swore in President Johnson, that the swearing-in ceremony took place aboard the presidential jet. That certainly is the first time that's ever happened in history.
Also the first woman to administer.
The first woman to ever administer the oath of office. These have occurred under unusual circumstances. I recall, and I'm trusting memory here, that when President Calvin Coolidge was sworn in, he was sworn in by his father in Vermont. Is that correct? Vermont?
I think so, Frank.
I believe his father was living in Vermont at that time. He was quite an elderly man, was a justice of the peace. Coolidge was roused from bed and told about the death of President Harding, and his elderly father, a justice of the peace, swore him in as President of the United States. It seemed to many at that time fitting that the ceremony would be very simple, take place in the parlor of this quite conservative old house in rugged New England territory. News of President Kennedy's assassination has mercifully been withheld from his 98-year-old maternal grandmother who lives in Boston. Mrs. John Fitzgerald is her name. She lives with a son, Thomas Fitzgerald, and he says he doesn't think that he will ever tell his mother that her grandson, the President of the United States, is now dead. And the 16-year-old daughter of Lyndon Johnson was in class today at the National Cathedral School for Girls in Washington when she heard of the assassination of President Kennedy. An aide to President Johnson said she told the school principal to release her to nobody but to the Secret Service. And the aide, Miss Willie Day Taylor, went to the Johnson home to be there when Lucy, the daughter, arrived.
Late films have arrived in our newsroom from Dallas showing the scenes of horror and disbelief outside Parkland Hospital. Newsmen hurry to the emergency room. The president's wife arrives, stunned. This is Mrs. Kennedy, in the middle. At this point, no one knew whether the president was alive or dead. Mrs. Kennedy conferring with a Dallas policeman who had sped the president to the hospital. And into the emergency room goes Mrs. Kennedy. A corsage of roses lies inside the car in which President Kennedy was shot. A stunned Congressman Jim Wright of Fort Worth tells what he saw from a few cars back. The disbelief registered on every face. These films from outside the emergency room of Parkland Hospital in Dallas as the president is dying inside. Senator Ralph Yarborough, who saw the shooting, said he heard shots and then saw a Secret Service man pound his fist against a rear fender of the presidential car in anguish. 2 priests arrived to administer last rites. Their names are not yet known. The deed still is not registered, with many outside the hospital. And the horror begins to sink in. We'll be back with more films from Dallas as soon as they arrive. Charles Murphy, WBAP-TV, Fort Worth, Dallas.
There is this reaction to the death of President Kennedy from French President Charles de Gaulle, who said President Kennedy died like a soldier under fire for his duty and in the service of his country. In the name of the French people, ever the friend of the American people, I salute this great example and this great memory. Not to dwell on maudlin items or to become too morose in this, but the Kennedy children, Caroline and John, as has been mentioned before, were at the White House today when they lost their father in Dallas, Texas. There is a story from Washington that it's believed that the task of telling them what has happened will be left to Mrs. Kennedy, and it's also recalled that earlier this year when she lost a baby, that the task of telling the children was left to the father, the president, who informed Caroline and young John that they had lost their baby brother. The children, to the best of our knowledge, have not yet been told what has happened, and perhaps that is all to the good. Frank?
As has no doubt become apparent to you now, all regular NBC programming has been canceled, and special NBC News reports will be brought to you continuously throughout the evening. Very few people are left alive now who can personally recall the assassination of an American president. That occurred, the last one occurred in 1901 when William McKinley was shot to death. And as we have said many times throughout the afternoon, we're relying entirely on memory for a good many of these things. But I believe he was shot to death in Buffalo, New York, was he not?
That's
Bill?
my recollection, Frank.
That was in 1901. And it seems that we always think this sort of thing can happen in other countries, but We don't really expect it to happen in the United States, but the historical record will not really bear us out on that. We have had a number of presidents assassinated in this country, the last being McKinley. They tried to shoot President Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, and then former President Truman again in 1950, and now John F. Kennedy in 1963.
The black, ugly words are in print. President shot dead, president dead. Common headlines that will appear on every newsstand of probably every newspaper in the world tomorrow morning. But there is the possibility, and it is a possibility only, that the man who perpetrated this action may have been found. Frank?
Well, his name is Lee H. Oswald. He has been arrested in connection with the shooting of a Dallas policeman outside a theater where police had been sent on a tip that the man had gone there. There is reason to believe, according to police, that he is somehow connected with the assassination of President Kennedy. He is being described now as a prime suspect, although the actual words that he is the man who committed the crime has not as yet been used. Not a great deal is known about this Oswald. We will get more information as we go on. We do know that he has been identified by police in Dallas as chairman of an organization known as Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And a police captain, Pat Ganaway, said the suspect was an employee in the building where the rifle used in the assassination was found. Ganaway said the suspect had visited Russia and was married to a Russian. This was not immediately confirmed. Now, according to my understanding, and Bill, you can help me with this, this is the building, a depository for books.
The Texas School Book Repository, I think it's called.
Which is located just across the parkway down which the presidential motorcade was traveling at that time. And is there not an arrow there?
The arrow,
the
yes, Frank, should be pointing to the 5th floor window from which it is believed the fatal shots were fired. And there were photographers who said they saw a rifle being pulled in from the window.
And you can see the people gathered outside the building. And then the rifle itself, I believe we have a picture of it.
Yes, there should be one there of the rifle being removed from the building. There it is, variously described as a 303. Or
perhaps some of the experts could recognize it immediately, but it obviously has a telescopic sight on it. And the best we can make out now, the president's motorcade had really traveled perhaps a few yards beyond this point, and that the fatal shots that were fired from behind and struck him in the back of the head. And then, incongruously, some way, another bullet struck him in the front of the neck.
One reporter, Frank, who was traveling in the motorcade, says it's his guess that the assassin had about a 45-degree angle on the president, so that it was not head-on or directly from the rear, but on the side. There's more on Oswald here, Frank.
Please, go ahead.
He came back to Fort Worth, it says here, from Russia last year after having been in the Soviet Union since 1959, where he worked in Minsk in a factory. Left after he apparently became disillusioned with life under communist rule. He'd gone to Russia after he got out of the Marine Corps, announced he wanted to stay there, changed his mind, then applied for a passport in '62, saying he wanted to return to the United States with the Russian wife he met and married in the Soviet Union. They have an infant child. It is not made clear here whether or not he brought the wife and child back to this country. Yes, it is. I'm reading as quickly as I can. Passport was issued, and he and his family came to this country. And it was in 1959, after he'd gone to the Soviet Union, that Oswald told American embassy officials there that he had applied for Soviet citizenship, but apparently he never followed through on that. Again, he is only a suspect, but he is identified as a prime suspect in the assassination of President Kennedy. It is reported from Washington that House Speaker McCormick says the president's body will lie in state at the White House tomorrow. Speaker McCormick said he thinks the body will be taken to the Capitol Sunday to remain in the Great Rotunda until about noon Monday. Further plans, as you can well appreciate, are indefinite, but it's understood that the actual funeral services will be held in Boston. Traditionally, presidents who die in office have lain in state in the Rotunda.
Former President Eisenhower has been among the world notables to give his reaction to the tragic loss of the American president. We'd like to bring you his statement at this time.
I share the sense of shock and dismay that the entire nation must feel at the despicable act that took the life of the nation's president. On the personal side, Mrs. Eisenhower and I share the grief that Mrs. Kennedy must now feel. And we send to her our prayerful thoughts and sympathetic sentiments in this hour.
General, how would you counsel the American people at this time?
In the face of such a terrible thing, I'm sure the entire citizenry of the nation will join as one man in expressing not only their grief but their indignation at this act, and will stand faithfully behind the government.
General, could you tell us how you got the word?
I was at a meeting for the United Nations, and while there, a member of the meeting was called out and came back and told us the news. Although at that time, we did not know the president was dead. We did not know when I got back here at that time that he was dead. But, matter of fact, we had the last message we had was one rather of hope. And the entire company merely paused for a minute at the request of the chairman, and each of us, in his own way, said a silent prayer for the president.
Should there be any concern, sir, over national security at a time like this?
No, I think the whole nation now would be almost all of us security agents.
General Eisenhower, will the nation be all right in the few months ahead?
Oh, I'm not going to predict anything of that. I just say this. The American nation is a people of great common sense, and they are not going to be stampeded or bewildered.
Thank you, Mr. President. How in history have assassinations affected the political course of events?
Well, of course, in Lincoln's assassination, the presidency went to a man who was a registered Democrat, Mr. Johnson. In Garfield, I doubt that there was any. And, of course, McKinley, that brought in Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, there have been other attempts in late years. Mr. Truman was at a grave threat to his life, and Mr. Roosevelt, just before he was inaugurated, you remember, when Mayor Cermak was killed, ran a very grave risk. These things have happened, and it seems inexplicable to me, because Americans are loyal. And it's just this occasional psychopathic sort of accident that occurs, and I don't know what we can do about it.
Could you say anything, General, about how people will feel abroad from all your experience with the United Nations and others? How will it be taken abroad?
Well, I think they will be a bit bewildered. This, in the civilized countries of the world, this doesn't happen so often. And you remember in the starting of World War I, the murder of the Archduke Ferdinand, I think his name was. Why, this itself almost, is one of the contributory causes to that war. And, but here, I just don't know what happens. But we are a nation where our freedoms are allowed, or are observed in such a way that everybody is ready everybody is, you might say, capable of doing this if he's ready to put his own life on the line.
General, how will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow? How will you spend the rest of today and tomorrow and the weekend?
Look, I have canceled the dinner date that I had for tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going immediately to my home, and if I'm wanted for any purpose whatsoever, I will, of course, be available.
Would you have any advice for the American people at this time, General?
No, as I said, I know the American people will stand solid, and they will not be stampeded.
Thank you, Mr. President.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Good night, fellows.
Former President Eisenhower commenting on the passing of President Kennedy, who was killed this afternoon in Dallas, Texas, by an assassin's bullet fired from a high-powered rifle. Frank?
Just late word from Dallas that the condition of Texas Governor John Connally, who was wounded in the assassination of President Kennedy, has been described in the most recent medical bulletin as satisfactory. Satisfactory is the condition of Texas Governor John Connally. As we have attempted to sort out our thoughts here as this afternoon has worn on, it occurs to us that perhaps within the last month, certainly within the last 45 days, the actual chief executive or head of government of all of the major Western allies, save France, has been changed. Britain has changed prime ministers, with Harold Macmillan retiring because of illness to be replaced by the new prime minister, Sir Alec Douglas Hume. A new government has been formed in Italy. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer is no longer the head of the West German state. He has been replaced by Chancellor Erhard. And now the assassination of the President of the United States being replaced by the Vice President, now the President, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So 4 of the 5 major Western allies have undergone a change in their head of government within, as we say, about the last 45, perhaps 30 days, leaving only General Charles de Gaulle of France, who has long since been the last active figure brought over from World War II. The plane with the President Johnson and the late President Kennedy is on its way to Washington, will arrive at Andrews Air Force Base shortly.
There's this report. We are going back over material you may have heard before, then again you may not. But it was said by doctors at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas who were in the emergency room where the president was brought, we never had any hope of saving his life. It is also reported by a New York Times reporter that the priest who administered the last rites of the Catholic Church to President Kennedy said that the president was already dead when he, the priest, arrived in the hospital. The very Reverend Oscar Huber said he had to draw back a sheet that was covering the president's face so he could begin administering the sacrament of extreme unction. This indicates, I think, again, the intense power of the weapon used. There is more here now on the man who may have done it, Lee Oswald. One police official, the head of the Dallas Homicide Division, Will Fritz, says that Oswald has not admitted anything yet, but he looks like a good suspect. That is all we have. There are many circumstantial things that would seem to link the man to it, but we do not yet have anything definitive.
And there is this about this sort of thing, as staggering and as cataclysmic as it is humbling in its own way. It makes us all realize our own mortality and what humans we are. And it is safe enough to say, certainly it can be said by those who remember the death of President Roosevelt, that this afternoon, wherever you were and whatever you might have been doing when you received the word of the death of President Kennedy, that is a moment that will be emblazoned in your memory, and you will never forget it as long as you live.
I think you're right, Frank. I can recall only one other occasion in which I underwent a similar experience. It was on a transport ship which had just docked in Saipan Harbor in April of 1945 when I learned that then President Roosevelt had died. And I think I can remember how the harbor smelled and how high the sun was and where the clouds were and everything else. And certainly today will be as indelibly dug into my mind as that morning was. It's a shocking thing, and it's just simply unbelievable. It couldn't have happened.
Perhaps we should remind you again that the people of the Soviet Union have been advised of the passing of, or the assassination of President Kennedy. There has been no official reaction beyond a telephone conversation between Andrei Gromyko and the American ambassador to Russia, Foy Kohler. And he expressed his profound shock and regrets and said that the official reaction of the Soviet government would be forthcoming shortly.
There must be in all of this some forward motion, even in the initial moments of shock. Even as President Lyndon Johnson, the moment he was sworn in to succeed John Fitzgerald Kennedy, turned to someone on Air Force One, the presidential plane, and said, I think it was, all right, let's get this plane to Washington. That may sound brusque, it may sound somewhat cold, but it is indicative that the affairs of the country, the running of the government must go forward, that it is a continuing process. And certainly there are people who, with no malice, with no cold-bloodedness, will be sitting in places all over the country and trying to determine exactly what impact this man's death will have on the future of this country, on the future of both political parties, and indeed on the future of the world and on its hopes for peace. They will recall the strength with which Mr. Kennedy faced up to the Russian threat in Cuba. They will wonder if we have other men who have the same strength, more strength, less strength. It's a shocking thing when the prow of the country, as it were, is suddenly removed from the ship and then another takes its place.
To Andrews Air Force Base in Washington and Robert Abernathy of NBC News.
The only thing I have, Bob, and I understand the president's changed his mind, he's not going to talk.
We are at Andrews Air Force Base waiting for the plane to arrive here. Several thousand people.
You're on the speaker.
Several thousand people waiting for the president to arrive at Andrews Air Force Base.
We are here, members of Congress have arrived. The leaders of both the Senate and the House are here. Their wands are with them. Their wands are in tears. You see the great jet arriving now. Here it is. It's come here. It's the great plane, the United States of America, that is rolling up to the concourse here.
And here is the plane now. Made the flight back from Dallas. Plane coming in here at Andrews Air Force Base, just outside Washington.
The presidential jet, momentarily, the lights went out here at the Air Force Base. The hundreds of reporters couldn't see anything. Now the lights are back on.
Cabinet officers, diplomats, senators, congressmen. This tragedy. Come out here in the dark. And honor guard now walking up to the tail of the presidential jet.
They're from Bolling Air Force Base. They're the regular honor guard that usually dispatches the president as well as welcomes him when he returns to Washington. An Army helicopter has just landed. It's making a great deal of noise.
What you see is a special truck that has been moved up to the rear of the presidential jet. A special truck on which the coffin will be brought out. A helicopter is standing by just near the presidential jet to take the coffin away.
The men are now struggling with the casket. It appears to be the casket, struggling to get it out of the plane. It's a bright, shiny casket. It's glistening in the lights here at the airport.
Casket is of dark brown in color, slightly reddish. It looks as if it's bronze.
The honor guard slowly marches away from the plane, leaving room for the elevator-like apparatus that is now being lowered. Seems to have got stuck. The apparatus is coming down now.
A Navy ambulance is being drawn up just near the truck which lowered the casket from the plane. It is our understanding here that the body will be flown by helicopter from here, possibly to Bethesda Naval Hospital.
Other senators have reported that the body will be taken by helicopter straight to the White House. There is some difference of opinion as to the exact plans. Behind the casket is Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. To her right is her brother-in-law, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy. They are helping her down out of that carrier that has just brought down the casket.
Mrs. Kennedy is apparently getting into the ambulance, the Navy ambulance, with the casket.
It was a very steep step that she had to jump down to get on the floor. Aides helped her do it. She was helped also by her brother-in-law, the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy.
President Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson are standing just near the door in the rear of the presidential jet, waiting.
Mrs. Lyndon Johnson is holding the new president's hand.
And the Navy ambulance moves off with the casket.
The ambulance is going to the other side of this airport. It is supposed to deliver the casket to the helicopters that are standing by.
The ambulance moving past the guard of honor, a cordon of soldiers, airmen lining the field here, and behind them thousands of young airmen from Andrews Air Force Base who have come here up to the fence to see.
The Secret Service man comes down the steps of the airplane. Now, new President Lyndon Baines Johnson with his wife, Lady Bird. They're coming down the steps. They are followed by Johnson aides, including Mrs. Carpenter, Mr. Bill Moyers, former Congressman Homer Thornberry,
It's the head of the Secret Service on the president's right. Secretary McNamara and other officials greeting the new president as he moves now in the direction of an Army helicopter.
That was Secretary McNamara, I think, who just leaned over and affectionately kissed Mrs. Johnson. We have heard that Lyndon Johnson, the new president, was going to make a speech here tonight on arrival. The microphones are set up. He appears to be walking toward them now. These microphones are just about 4 feet back from an encased area for the press.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
Walks away. He's greeted by Republican Senate Leader Everett Dirksen of Illinois. Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic whip of the Senate, also talking to him. President Johnson has called a meeting of the leaders of both parties, both houses of Congress, to meet with him at the White House tonight at 7:15.
Senator Dirksen said earlier this evening that he thought the plans of Congress would depend on precisely when the funeral is. Many members want to go to Boston for the funeral. But he said he did not feel that Congress would adjourn or recess because of what has happened.
The President is still talking with leaders of the Senate. Mrs. Maureen Mansfield is there with Senator Mansfield, the Democratic Senate leader. Mrs. Mansfield was weeping before, as were many of the women who came out here to the airport. The Office of Protocol tells us that almost every embassy in town called the State Department today to find out the plans so that they could be here when the plane arrived at Andrews Air Force Base.
Now President Johnson is moving towards the Army helicopter for the flight to the White House, where he has a meeting scheduled tonight with Secretary McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, other officials.
He's shaking hands now with Bill Moyers, one of his aides who was with him during the campaign and who has been with him in most of his activities for the past several years. One of the people who came out here was Senator Aiken, who said, "I'm just beginning to realize what happened. President Johnson needs our help." Chief of Protocol Andrew Biddle Duke was out here meeting President Lyndon Johnson.
This entire ceremony here has been hastily improvised. Telephone circuits, all plans put together very quickly.
The Secret Service handled all the arrangements of the late president's body and the arrangements for President Lyndon Johnson's arrival. The Air Force Base itself, the Air Force handled all the many other details that were necessary at a time like this. The helicopter bearing new President Lyndon Johnson is about to take off.
Now the Army helicopter preparing to take off. The rotor's beginning. Take off for the short flight from Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington to the south lawn of the White House in downtown Washington.
Inside the helicopter, you can see aides talking in animated, very concentrated conversation. With new President Lyndon Baines Johnson is his wife, Lady Bird, who is always at his side. She has been with him in his long road up the political ladder from the days he started out from Stonewall, Texas. The honor guard is now disappearing from the field. Press dignitaries are moving away. The plane, the presidential plane, the United States of America, it bears no other insignia but that. There, the baggage is being taken off, hastily packed. Now the 55-year-old Lyndon Baines Johnson is on his way to the White House, the first time he will enter the White House as president.
Thus, the arrival in Washington, the body of the late President John F. Kennedy and President Lyndon B. Johnson. President Johnson walked off the aircraft rather slowly, his wife beside him. He walked up to a cluster of microphones and said, "This is a sad time for all people." Speaking of the death of the president, he said, "It's a loss that cannot be weighed." He called it a deep personal loss. Then President Johnson said, "I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's." That is all he had to say. We are told that the president's body, which was removed from the aircraft first in casket, placed in a naval ambulance, will be taken to Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that tomorrow the president's body will lie in the East Room of the White House. There are no announced plans for any public viewing of the president's body. There will be none tomorrow. Members of the family, top officials of the government, members of Congress, and members of the diplomatic corps will go to the White House tomorrow at specified times to pay their respects to the late John F. Kennedy. President Johnson is on his way to the White House now. Later this evening, he will meet with Defense Secretary McNamara, with McGeorge Bundy, the presidential advisor, and then with leaders of both parties from the House and the Senate for discussions. He was met at the airport by members of Congress. Senator Mansfield was there, as was Senator Dirksen, the Republican leader in the Senate. President Johnson looked extremely severe, extremely shaken by what he had gone through, as did his wife, Mrs. Johnson, standing by his side as he spoke his first public words as President of the United States, the 36th President. He had been sworn in only about 2.5 to 3 hours earlier by a federal judge in the executive suite of the aircraft in which he arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, in the executive suite of Air Force One, sworn in with his wife and Mrs. Kennedy and as many White House aides as could be crowded into that suite looking on as Federal Judge Sarah Hughes administered the oath of office to Lyndon Baines Johnson. And so, events which started swiftly, completely unexpectedly and shockingly in Dallas only a matter of about 5 hours ago have gone virtually full circle. The president and the late president are, in a sense, back home, back in the nation's capital. The business of running and governing this nation will go on.
Darkness has settled on the eastern part of the United States. John F. Kennedy, who departed the White House Thursday morning as President of the United States, has returned the victim of an assassin in Dallas, Texas. The man suspected of having committed this offense is under arrest. His name is Lee Oswald. He is now being investigated and interrogated by federal and state authorities in Texas. The new President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, has arrived with the First Lady at the White House. He will spend the night there.
Here is a picture of the swearing in of the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson. We understand that he was sworn in during the sad flight back to Washington from Dallas. On the right of your screen, you see Mrs. Kennedy, President Johnson, and Mrs. Johnson. He was sworn in by Federal District Judge Hughes of Dallas, Texas, so we are given to understand. None of us will ever forget where he was and how he felt when the news was announced. In New York City, for a handful of people, the place was the sidewalk beside the open door of NBC News reporter Gabe Pressman's automobile, listening to the loudspeaker, the car radio. They had known for some minutes that the president was gravely wounded. Then came the instant when the worst was confirmed.
A flash from Dallas. 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. This is the latest information we have from Dallas. Of course, standing by to give you all available information as it comes to us. I will repeat with the greatest regret this flash. 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he has died of bullet wounds.
Find it hard to believe.
2 sources.
Please go ahead. It's hard to believe it.
Hard to believe it's right. I don't know what to say.
Press Secretary.
Well, I know whoever catches them, they deserve the worst. 5 years old.
During a motorcade drive through downtown Dallas. The president died. Approximately 25 minutes.
Among others, there was a stunned silence and a groping to come to terms with a fact that was almost beyond belief. The face and voice of a young girl summed it up.
Bleeding and unconscious.
What's your feeling right now?
I really couldn't say. Really, right now I just don't know what to do. I don't even know where to go, what to say. There's nothing for me to say.
It was much the same all across the country, a wave of shock. Here is Chicago at the same hour. Floyd Kalber reports from NBC News, Chicago.
Asking for sound and picture of it. In Chicago, gray clouds hung low and a fine drizzle of rain fell when the first word of the tragedy was heard. Learning that the president was critically wounded, stunned Chicagoans turned to their churches, leaving their offices in the Loop, their homes and businesses in the suburbs. When confirmation came a short while later that the president's wounds were fatal, the grief of the mourners became more evident in tears, looks of dazed disbelief. In In some churches, priests and ministers took to the pulpit to offer eulogies and lead their congregations in prayer. In most cases, the churches were simply open as a haven for those wishing to add their prayers to the millions of others around the world, to recite the rosary, or simply to light a candle. Lloyd Kalber, NBC News, Chicago.
In Washington, where everything revolves around the government, and this is a company town, really, and where the president is more than any one person revolves around him, and where in many cases the grief today was personal among people who knew him and worked for him. Here are a few pictures, rather random in nature, of some of the sights around Washington today. Flags on embassies as well as on all other public buildings at half staff. That, incidentally, is the Russian embassy. This is Lafayette Park, immediately across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House, where as soon as the first news came out, people began to gather and stand, as they often do. Just stand. The police roped off the sidewalk immediately in front of the White House. St. Matthew's Cathedral is a few blocks from the White House.
I rushed up to the chair and said, Senator Kennedy, your brother, the president, has been shot. He gave a jerk to his body tensed, but he was absolutely calm. And as I recall, Senator Kennedy, then presiding over the Senate, when he heard this awful news, said no. And that was all.
That was Robert Riddell, a member of the staff of the U.S. Senate, who took the news here to Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, who is here with his sister Eunice, leaving in a helicopter for Andrews Base, where they then took a jet plane to Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts. Now some comments from members of the Senate.
We knew him and loved him in West Virginia. I think he loved us. Mountaineers can hardly express their sadness at his going. And this afternoon, I hope in just these few rather faltering words, I can speak, at least in part, for the people of my state.
This good, this decent, this kindly man, this harassed man who had so much on his shoulders and received from some people so little in the way of support in return, this man has now gone to his reward.
There are some things that are simply incredible and leave one absolutely speechless. This is one of them.
The assassin's bullet has removed from the most vital station on earth a brilliant and dedicated young statesman at the very height of his powers. And I know that all Americans, no matter where they come from or how they are made in God's fashion, will rally in support behind the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson.
Those are comments from members of the Senate, both parties. Chet?
Dallas police are holding a suspect in the president's assassination, 24-year-old Lee H. Oswald. Shortly after the president and Governor Connally were shot, police chased Oswald into a movie theater. Police said he fired at them, killing patrolman J.D. Tippett. A rifle was found in a building where he worked. Oswald once served in the United States Marines. In 1959, he was in Moscow, where he said he wanted to become a Russian citizen, saying that leaving this country was like getting out of a prison. But last summer, he was back in the United States. In New Orleans, police arrested him after he got into a fight while distributing literature for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an organization that at least sympathizes with the Castro government. Here is the interview he gave at that time to station WDSU-TV in New Orleans.
No, sir, I'm not a communist, and I think that the red herring and so forth is rather ridiculous to toss into this conversation.
Then are you a Marxist?
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
What is the difference between the two?
Well, there's a great deal of difference. Several American parties in several countries are based on Marxism, such as Ghana. Certain countries have characteristics of a socialist system, such as Great Britain with its socialized medicine. These, then, are the differences between an outright communist country and countries which adhere to leftist or Marxist principles.
In your work with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, what are you advocating?
We advocate restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba.
The president was a family man, and his wife was among his most valuable political assets. The Kennedys were married while he was still a senator, but Mrs. Kennedy never really got accustomed to traveling the political circuit. It was, therefore, a little unusual that she went with him on this two-day swing through Texas. This morning, when they arrived in Dallas, the people there got a glimpse of the president as a family man. Here is a report from Robert McNeil at station WBAP, Fort Worth.
The president began the day by playing with much enjoyment the role of the husband of Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. The first act of the day was a short walk in the rain to a crowd across from the hotel, a spirited speech, and a reference to his wife that delighted the people and set a gay tone for the whole morning.
I appreciate your being here this morning. Mr. Kennedy is organizing yourself. It takes longer. But because she looks better than we do.
The president was in his best form, looking refreshed after a good night's sleep, reveling in the crisp morning, and invigorated by his reception. There was more cheering and handshaking inside the hotel, where the president attended a Chamber of Commerce breakfast. But as all the people on the platform were introduced, there were more and more whispers of, "Where is Jackie?" Mrs. Kennedy, in fact, was waiting outside the room for a cue to enter. It was she many came to see, and finally they did. It looked as though there would be a lot of scenes like this in the future. The feuding in the Texas Democratic Party, which had preoccupied the statewide press for the visit, was not able to distract the rank and file from the glamour of having the president and his wife to visit.
Ladies and gentlemen, I proudly present the President of the United States.
It was the kind of occasion John Kennedy had delighted in before, and his mind went back to a day as sunny and brilliant as this one in Texas, a day in Paris 2.5 years ago, when the freshness of this American couple took the French by storm.
I know now why everyone in Texas, Fort Worth, is so thin, having gotten up and down about 9 times. This is what you do every morning. Mr. Buck, Mr. Vice President, Governor Conley, Senator Yarborough, Jim Wright, members of the congressional delegation, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Attorney General, ladies and gentlemen. 2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas.
Over at St. Patrick's Cathedral, within the hour, I noticed that every available candle in the church was already lighted. There was not one that you could walk in and light. in offering of prayers for the soul of President Kennedy. Across the street from the cathedral, one of the Fifth Avenue department stores had lowered the blinds on every single display window on 50th and 49th Streets and on Fifth Avenue, save one. The corner window at 50th and 5th held an oil portrait of President Kennedy and about 6 dozen red roses. That is all. There is this note on how some school children found out about what happened today. High school children in one New Jersey town were told, bluntly, truthfully, exactly what had happened. Grammar school children in the same town were told only something dreadful has happened. Go straight home immediately after school. They did, and told their mother that something dreadful had happened and asked what it was. The mother turned on the radio, and the family found out together exactly what it was and just how dreadful it is. Trying to assess now the impact on citizens in the city of New York of what happened today, and here is a report from NBC's Gabe Pressman.
For the first time since the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the lights of Broadway have been blacked out voluntarily. The theaters are closed. The Great White Way is dark. Normally tens of thousands of people are here. On a Friday night tonight, the streets, relatively speaking, are deserted. A large cluster of people around our mobile unit, but the stores are closed. The signs are dark, and here in Times Square, the bustling, exciting atmosphere of a normal weekend night is missing. In the faces of the people and talking to them, you hear again and again the words incredible. I still don't believe it. When I heard the news, I cried, I prayed. The atmosphere is most solemn. It is most depressing. We've seen those sailors here tonight with sweethearts on their arm. We've seen no smiles, no laughter. The cop on the beat here is Patrolman Martin Friedel. Patrolman Friedel, have you ever seen Times Square like this?
All the time I've been here, I've never seen it like this. I mean, it's really something. You can sense the remorselessness on the people's faces. You can see it on them, and you can also sense it. I myself and all the officers I've seen, I talked to, they all feel the same way. They all have like an open feeling in their stomach, just like I have. It's really something. It's really bad. I mean, even in the station house, there was no kidding around or anything like that today. Everybody was just dead serious.
And you yourself?
Myself, like I said before, I've got an open feeling in my stomach. It's really tragic.
Very few people here compared to a normal Friday night.
Well, this is by no means a normal Friday night. Not by any means, not close to it. All your theaters are shut down, all the movies. The people are around, but Broadway is not Broadway tonight. Not the way it usually is.
Thank you, Patrolman Friedel. That was Patrolman Martin Friedel of the Times Square Area Police Force. Yes, the police of New York reflect the overwhelming feeling of depression, of sadness on the part of the people. This is not a normal night, as Patrolman Friedel said. There's overwhelming sadness. There's a great sense of abnormalcy, of solemnity. Times Square and Broadway, dark, solemn, sad, depressed on the night of the day that President John F. Kennedy died. Gabe Pressman, NBC News, Times Square.
We do have this further word from Dallas. The prime suspect being held in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy is Lee H. Oswald. As you are perhaps aware, a Dallas policeman was killed a short time after the president was assassinated in a gun struggle with Oswald, and Oswald has been formally charged with that murder. However, no charges, so far as we know, have yet been lodged against him in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy. We have a report from Dallas bearing on this suspect, Oswald, and says the gunman who slew the President of the United States was a calculating man, that he had to be. For the shots that killed the President and wounded Texas Governor John Connally came from a pre-selected spot with a clear view of the motorcade. And there was evidence that the gunman sat and calmly gnawed fried chicken, waiting for the moment to kill. Police have one suspect, a man with ties to the shooting, but Lee H. Oswald, who is 24 years old, after 2 hours of questioning, more than that by now, is still clinging to his story that he did not do it. The fatal shots came from a floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. It was at a 45-degree angle about 100 yards away. Police know at least that much. They found the rifle partly hidden behind some books. It was a bolt-action model. We still do not know exactly what kind of rifle it was. We've had conflicting reports throughout the afternoon, some saying that it was British, others that it was German, even Japanese. They found some spent cartridges and scraps of the chicken meal. Thousands of persons were in the vicinity. The route of the president had been well publicized, and maps in the newspapers were pinpointed with the route that the president's motorcade would follow. 45 minutes after the president was shot, a Dallas policeman was slain, and this led to the arrest of Oswald, who has now been charged with that murder. Oswald was taken from a small theater, and he put up a fight, firing once from a pistol and cutting patrolman N.M. McDonald in a scuffle. Oswald, who's about 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighs about 160 pounds, answered the description of a young man sighted at the book depository building just before the president was shot. He was arrogant as he was brought in for questioning. When he saw a crowd of newsmen, he raised his handcuffed hands in a clenched fist. Now, we have mobile units stationed at several locations. One of them is just outside the RCA building here at 30 Rockefeller Center in New York. And people are milling about the streets, still really unable to accommodate themselves to the happenings of the day. But we would like to get some reaction from the ordinary citizen, so let's go to that camera location outside the RCA building and NBC's Jeffrey Pond.
In the crowd with us right now are several visitors from abroad. Where are you from, sir?
From India.
Did you approve of President Kennedy's policies?
Oh yes, we approved it very much. In fact, he was the best president we liked in India, and in President Kennedy's death, we have lost a very good friend.
The sense of loss is worldwide.
Yeah, I think so, yes. But in India, we have lost a very, very good friend. He did quite a lot for India, I mean, especially during the Chinese crisis and some other time also.
Thank you, sir. I understand you were born abroad, too. Did you like the president?
Oh, I admired him very much. I thought he was very intelligent and able and courageous, and I'm very, very sorry and very sad. And although not being an American, I feel somewhat an American tonight.
Are you worried about the impact on world affairs?
Oh, yes. I hope, nevertheless, that what President Kennedy stood for will be carried on.
What did you approve of most?
Well, I admired him very much for his firm stand during the Cuban crisis, and also for his stand on civil rights, and this is something I also stand for and admire him for.
Thank you very much. This is Jeff Pond, NBC News, New York, returning you to our New York studios.
Perhaps that young lady who just spoke with NBC's Jeffrey Pond summed it up for the entire world. She, though foreign-born, feels somewhat of an American tonight.
We will hear much in the next days and weeks about the continuity of our government. President Kennedy has been killed. President Johnson has taken over. The business of government goes on. We may draw some satisfaction from the fact that the business of government goes on, but it is not a cause for congratulation. It is what should be expected, even from what we Americans are tonight, a grossly diminished people.
All across the United States, people are still, I think, perhaps responding more with disbelief even yet than any other single emotion to the tragedy which occurred today. This is mingled with shock and anger and a genuine puzzlement that this sort of thing can happen in our country at this late stage in our development. One of the places where we have had cameras brought out and mobile units set up is in San Francisco. So for a sampling of the mood in that West Coast city, we now go to station KRON-TV in San Francisco and Jerry Jensen.
The atmosphere of gloom and silent despair which has fallen over every part of the United States today is very clearly in evidence here in San Francisco. And any difference in the reaction of the people here on the West Coast is perhaps due to the difference in time. Because of the time difference, people in San Francisco learned of the tragic assassination of President Kennedy even before noon today, so that they have had one half of a whole working day to contemplate this tragedy. A large crowd is now gathered. I'd like to get some reaction from you people. How do you feel about hearing this news?
I still can't believe it. I know it happened, but I still can't believe it.
Where were you when you first learned of the death?
I work here at the Chronicle. I was at my desk.
Sir, what are your feelings?
I was shocked and almost beyond belief. I was at work when I first heard of it in Richmond, and knew somebody came into the office and mentioned something about it. It's still too much to believe. I'm very saddened by the horrible thing that happened. It's almost impossible still to comprehend the terrible disaster.
Thank you. And you, sir?
Well, I think this is something that everyone in the country shares the blame for, and I hope that everyone, especially the Southern white moderates, take every possible step they can to see that it never happens again or anything like it. I hope that the moderates, especially in the South, do everything they can to quell this type of fanaticism and stop it. This is going to destroy the South and perhaps the whole country.
Sir?
Well, sir, I work for the Chronicle in the printing department as a machinist, and I was very saddened and shocked. Everybody I worked with was very heartfelt and sad. Mr. Kennedy, who has helped to do so much for our country, uniting for peaceful purposes and banning the bomb and civil actions that Mr. Kennedy was always for, and I feel it's a great loss to the country.
Thank you, sir. Perhaps the best reaction is best summed up. A hero is dead, and the people know it. This is Jerry Jensen reporting from San Francisco.
And I believe NBC's Bill Ryan has an interesting footnote to this story.
Yes, Frank, when you get a story as big as this one, the facilities of all the news gathering organizations are devoted to it, and so you get a tremendous amount of information. Among the items turned up is the fact that it was a $435.71 United States government loan that enabled Lee Harvey Oswald to come back to this country 18 months ago after he'd spent 2.5 years in the Soviet Union. This is the man who was under arrest in Dallas, Texas for the murder of a Dallas policeman today, and who may have been the man who fired the shot that took President Kennedy's life. It is standard procedure for an American citizen when he is in trouble overseas in a foreign country and unable to get home to go to the United States Embassy or consulate and appeal for government funds to get him home. Apparently this is what Oswald did in the Soviet Union 18 months ago. The government gave him $435.71, and that's how he came back here.
Now we would like to get the late developments in Washington by returning to Washington and David Brinkley.
Well, this one is not from Washington, Frank, but the Dallas police reported a moment ago that a foreign-made rifle believed to have been used in the shooting of the president had no fingerprints on it. It has been sent here to the FBI laboratory in Washington for an analysis.
We have some late word on the condition of Governor John Connally of Texas, who was wounded by the sniper who assassinated President Kennedy. The latest report says that he is in stable and satisfactory condition tonight. He apparently has not learned of the president's death yet, however. Dr. Robert W. Shaw said Connally, who underwent surgery for more than an hour, was in better spirits. He said he did not anticipate Connally getting any worse and no further surgery is planned. Shaw, the attending physician, said the governor was apparently struck by just one bullet that traveled through his chest, hit his wrist, and lodged in his thigh. Connally rode in the same car with Kennedy. NBC's Robert McNeil was in Dallas and was almost directly behind the president's car in the first bus of news correspondents when the president was felled by the sniper's bullet. And he is still on duty in the Dallas-Fort Worth area now, so we would like to go to WBAP-TV in Fort Worth, Dallas, and NBC's Robert McNeil.
It was one of those days that a reporter finds himself musing about when he's half asleep sometimes in a plane. Your mind drifts as you prepare for the big story. What is likely to happen at this moment and that? Sometimes your mind drifts to the most extreme thing that could happen, and you hastily dismiss it because the most extreme thing never does happen. You pull your mind back to the ordinary things that always do happen. This day began in the rain with the ordinary things for a popular president on a grassroots tour, even if it was ostensibly non-political. For a young president with politics in his blood, a refreshing contact with the source of his power, a delirious crowd outside his Fort Worth hotel. His wife, he told them, wasn't there because she was still organizing herself. It takes her longer, the president said, because she looks better than we do.
Take longer. But because she looks better than we do.
Mrs. Kennedy did appear a little later at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast, timing her entry by waiting outside the door until all others were introduced. She appeared with thunderous applause, radiant in a pink suit and matching pillbox hat. This caused her husband to think back to a day 2.5 years ago in Paris.
Years ago, I said that introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas.
A new Mrs. Kennedy has emerged this trip, a first lady no longer shy about the rough and tumble of politics. On arrival in Dallas from Fort Worth, she was true to her new form. She plunged ahead of the president into the ecstatic crowds. Some of them caught her glove, mauled her sleeve, even grabbed one of the roses off its stem. There were no hostile signs at the airport crowd, only eagerness for contact with the Kennedys. Then into the open limousine for the motorcade through Dallas. The president had done this thousands of times. He sat on the right, Mrs. Kennedy on the left. Everywhere the crowds were bigger than expected. Dallas authorities were jittery. Security precautions were the heaviest in the city's history. Dallas was determined that its name, smirched round the world by the attack on UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson last month, would not be dragged through the mud again. There were heavy police forces all along the route. All possible troublemakers had been searched out and warned. All but one. The downtown streets. In the first press bus, we strained to catch any signs of the hostility the Dallas precautions had led us to expect. But all we saw was a vast and friendly crowd, but many thousands of welcome jack signs. It's approaching 12:30 p.m. Dallas time. The crowds in the tall business district are overfilling the sidewalks. Some throw streamers and torn paper in a miniature ticker tape parade. The reporters look at each other. There have been no incidents. At about 12:32, the motorcade turns a corner into a parkway. The crowds are thinner. NBC cameraman Dave Wigman, in a car ahead of us, takes a passing shot of a building. Then 3 shots are heard, like toy explosions. Wigman jumps from his car, running towards the president with his camera running. People scream and lie down, grabbing their children. I leave the motorcade and run after police who appear to be chasing somebody. The motorcade moves off fast. We don't know it, but the president is mortally wounded in the head and throat. His car races for the hospital. The police find no one and return. Looking for a phone, I go into an office. It's on the ground floor of this building, the Texas School Book Depository. It is not more than 4 minutes after the shooting. Minutes after a man on the 5th floor of the same building has abandoned a high-powered rifle and fled. Waves of police move in. A small Negro boy tells them he saw a man with a rifle in a window upstairs. Witnesses come up. They saw the president hit. One of the witnesses took this Polaroid picture at the instant of the shooting. It shows the president slumped down in the car.
Just as Mary started to take the picture and the president came right even with us, 2 shots, we looked at him and he was looking at a dog in the middle of the seat. 2 shots rang out and he grabbed his chest and a look of pain on his face and fell across toward Jackie, and she fell over on him and said, "My God, he's shot." And there was an interval, and then 3 or 4 more shots rang out. By that time, the motorcade had sped away.
The motorcade reaches Parkland Memorial Hospital. It goes immediately to the emergency entrance. Bleeding profusely and unconscious, the president is lifted onto a stretcher and carried to emergency operating room number 1. Doctors say his condition is grave and moribund, that is, near death on arrival. A senior house physician is in attendance. A professor of neurosurgery and other doctors come immediately. Mrs. Kennedy, untouched by the bullets, is with her husband. Texas Governor John Connally, also seriously wounded, is also in an emergency ward. The doctors try every possible way to save the president. Oxygen is given and anesthetics, a blood transfusion, a tracheotomy, that is, making an opening in the throat to aid breathing. The president's heart stops. External massage was applied to his chest, but no pulse results. A priest is called to administer the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church. At approximately 1 o'clock, the president is dead. The doctors were working too frantically to revive him to notice the exact moment. The press and public do not know the president is dead for another half hour. The only reports available are that he is gravely wounded. At 1:31 Central Time, White House Assistant Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff tells the press the president is dead. At that moment, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, suddenly the new president, leaves the hospital. A new Secret Service detail just arrived, forms up around him, and he leaves for the airport. There, in the president's jet plane, Air Force One, a hastily summoned woman federal judge with a borrowed Bible administers the oath of office. The president's body, in a bronze coffin, is flown to Washington. Dallas police moved with great speed after the shooting. The story of the chase, arrest, and questioning of a suspect from NBC's Tom Pettit at police headquarters in Dallas.
In Fort Worth, 28 miles west of Dallas, police picked up one suspect who was later cleared and released. The man apprehended was identified by Fort Worth police as 22-year-old Donald House of Ranger, Texas. House was picked up after Dallas police put out a pickup order on his car following the shooting and killing of a Dallas police officer. As he was taken into police headquarters, House shouted, "I didn't do it." And after questioning, he was completely cleared and released. In Dallas, the prime suspect still is being questioned. He is 24-year-old Lee Oswald of Dallas, a former Marine who spent some time in Russia, who at one time had applied for Soviet citizenship. He has been associated with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Dallas homicide captain Will Fritz has directed the interrogation of this suspect, who police say has been placed in the building from where the bullets were fired at President Kennedy. Oswald has been charged with the murder of police officer J.D. Tippett, who had gone to apprehend Oswald, but he denies killing President Kennedy, says he is being held because he was in Russia. But Dallas Police Chief J.E. Curry says interrogation of Oswald will continue, that he is a very good suspect in the death of President Kennedy. Tom Pettit, NBC News, at Dallas Police Headquarters.
Dallas Police Chief Jess Curry has recently reported that his men have found a partial fingerprint on the rifle believed used in the assassination. The weapon will be sent to Washington to ensure proper handling of the print. The city of Dallas, like the country, is still in a state of shock tonight. Texas Governor John Connally is in serious but satisfactory condition in hospital. Everyone, public officials, the police, the newspapers, have been too busy to ask the questions about loopholes in security that inevitably will be asked. As President Eisenhower said today, this is the kind of thing that freedom, compatible with democracy, makes possible. The mayor of Dallas, Earl Cabell, in a statement of the city's remorse, has said that all churches in the city will be open tonight. Dallas feels, as any American city would, if this had happened not here today, but there. This is Robert McNeil, NBC News, reporting.
It has all been shocking, but perhaps one element in the shock was the speed. By the Washington clock, at a little after 1 o'clock this afternoon, President Kennedy was about as alive as any human being ever gets. Young, strong, vigorous, looking forward to, no doubt, 5 more years, he hoped, of leadership in this country and of the Western world. His wife, young, beautiful, looking very happy, was beside him and seeming to be having a wonderful time and leaning across the back seat of the car to say to him, "You can't say Dallas hasn't been friendly to you." And that was a little after 1 o'clock. 5 hours later, at 6 o'clock, Mr. Kennedy had been murdered. Lyndon Johnson was President of the United States. Mrs. Kennedy was a widow, a brave and composed one that nobody could fail to admire. All of them were back in Washington, returning in the same airplane that took them to Texas to an incredible tragedy. And the sheer speed of it was just too fast for the senses. Roosevelt, dead of a stroke, came back here from Warm Springs, Georgia, in a train, the sides of it draped in black crepe. It steamed majestically across the southern landscape toward Washington, taking a little time about it and giving everybody a time to think a bit about what had happened. But not today. There is seldom any time to think anymore, and today there was none. In about 4 hours, we had gone from President Kennedy in Dallas alive to back in Washington dead, and a new president in his place. There is no more news here tonight, and really no more to say, except that what has happened today has been just too much, too ugly, and too fast. Frank?
Thank you, Dave. The Dallas Police Chief, Jesse Curry, announced just a few moments ago that charges of murdering President Kennedy have been filed against Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine with a history of connection with left-wing causes.
The 24-year-old prisoner, who has been under questioning by Dallas police for over 8 hours, has just been formally charged with the murder of President Kennedy. But the prisoner, Lee Oswald, has not admitted the shooting himself, and Dallas Police Chief Jess Curry describes him as a stoic individual who admits nothing. He believes he's being held because he once lived in Russia. Oswald, who said 2 years ago he wanted Russian citizenship, was fined $10 recently in New Orleans for distributing communist literature. He's married to a Russian woman who was brought to the police station with their small daughter and his mother, who lives in a Dallas suburb. She was also questioned and said, "I am heartbroken about this. He is really a good boy." Oswald's only comment to the world at large since his arrest has been a denial.
Oswald, did you shoot the president?
I didn't shoot anybody, sir. I haven't been told what I'm here for.
You have a lawyer?
No, sir, I don't. I just been...
Look back, you want to go too?
Police Sergeant Gerald Hill describes Oswald's capture.
Appreciate it. C.C. Walker, Bob Carroll, Paul Bentley, K.E. Lyons, myself, and other officers went into the building, and we began a systematic check of all the suspects or all the people who were in the theater. As Officer McDonald approached a suspect sitting on the third row from the back of the theater, the suspect jumped up, yelled, "This is it," and took a swing at the officer. Officer McDonald started to grapple with the man as he reached for a gun which was concealed under his shirt, and the gun was fired one time by the suspect, but luckily it misfired. The pin hit the shell, but it did not fire. McDonald yelled for help. The other officers in the theater and I managed to subdue the man, disarm him, and handcuff him. At that time, we brought him out of the building, put him in a squad car, and brought him straight to homicide and robbery and turned him over to Captain Fritz. Who are those officers?
So although he has not yet admitted the shooting, the suspect Lee Oswald has been formally charged with murdering President Kennedy. Circumstantial evidence puts him in the room from which the shots were fired. Lab tests are being conducted to prove that he fired the murder rifle. Robert McNeil, NBC News, reporting.
There is no way of calculating the millions of words that have been uttered in the course of this day in all countries of the world as human beings fumble for words to express their offended senses at what has happened in the United States. I I seriously doubt that any words uttered by anyone anywhere have succeeded in expressing what you feel yourself. I would suppose that the answer for that is only to be found in the hearts of each of us. This concludes NBC's coverage for today. We will resume our coverage tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock with the NBC Today show. They will continue until 10. At that time, the NBC News team that has manned this desk today will return, and we will continue our coverage until 2:30 tomorrow afternoon. At that time, NBC's local affiliates will continue with their coverage of the events as they continue to unfold. At 5 o'clock, NBC will return to the air tomorrow afternoon and bring you coverage throughout the evening. This is Frank McGee, NBC News, speaking for Bill Ryan, Chet Huntley, David Brinkley, Herb Kaplow, Peter Hackus, Robert McNeil, and literally hundreds of other technicians and newsmen who have worked throughout the day to bring you this sad story. November the 22nd, into the history books, stamped forever with the blackness of this day's deed. Thank you. Good night.